There are moments in history when the very earth seems to hold its breath, when nations fracture, not with a sudden explosion, but with a deep and painful tear through their collective soul. The American Civil War was not just a clash of armies or a battle of ideals. It was a slow descent into a living nightmare, where the air hung heavy with smoke and the ground pulsed with decay. Across vast fields and forgotten towns, the soil itself became part of the story, drinking in blood, rotting flesh, and shattered dreams. It was a time when courage and horror walked side by side, when every sunrise revealed more bodies than the day before, and when the promise of unity was paid for in unimaginable suffering. Tonight, as we drift through the quiet corridors of that dark past, let the whispers of history guide us through the echoes of pain, resilience, and the haunting beauty of survival. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In the decade before the storm, America breathed with a kind of strained unease, a deep, quiet tension that hummed beneath the surface of ordinary life. It was the 1850s, an era that should have been filled with the optimism of a growing nation, yet every street corner, every newspaper column, every whispered conversation carried a different weight, the unmistakable heaviness of division. The country was still young, barely a lifetime old, and yet its foundations were already groaning under the pressure of irreconcilable beliefs. Freedom, that shining word which had built the nation's identity, had grown warped by contradiction. In the cotton fields of the South, that same freedom was denied to millions of enslaved men and women, their lives measured not in years but in profit. The industrial North, clothed in smoke and iron, looked toward the future with restless ambition. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia pulsed with invention, railroads, and the hum of progress. But that same progress was driven, in no small part, by the raw materials picked by enslaved hands hundreds of miles away. In the South, sprawling plantations stretched across the horizon, their wealth rooted in human suffering. It was a system old and cruel, yet fiercely defended by those who believed their very survival depended upon it. To them, slavery was not an evil to be ended, but a divine order, something ancient and natural. Each side saw the other not merely as opponents but as threats to the very meaning of America. The North spoke of liberty, reform and expansion, while the South clung to sovereignty, tradition and the preservation of its social hierarchy. Newspapers printed words like weapons, pamphlets spread through towns like sparks in dry grass, abolition, states' rights, secession, war. In 1850, the uneasy compromise that bore that year's name tried to hold the peace. California entered the Union as a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Act, a law forcing the return of escaped slaves to their owners, sent tremors through the conscience of the North. The act made bounty hunters into national figures, dragging men and women from northern streets back into bondage. Families watched in horror as the lines between free and enslaved blurred into something lawless. Even those who had never taken a side now felt the sting of moral conflict. By 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act struck another blow to unity. The law allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether they would permit slavery. The result was blood. Settlers flooded Kansas with rifles and rage, each side determined to shape the state's future. Bleeding Kansas, as newspapers called it, became a prelude to the larger carnage to come, small skirmishes foreshadowing a nation's coming dismemberment. In those years, the name of John Brown began to drift through the national consciousness like a specter. A man driven by unbending conviction, Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 was meant to ignite a slave uprising. It failed, ending in his capture and execution, but his final words, "The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood," seemed to hang over the country like prophecy. Many in the North called him a martyr, many in the South a terrorist, yet all agreed that something had shifted. The line had been crossed. As the 1850s closed, the political landscape fractured beyond repair. The old parties, Whigs and Democrats alike, splintered under the strain of moral contradiction. In their place rose a new political force, the Republican Party, founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery, and when in 1860, a tall, solemn man from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, the illusion of unity finally crumbled. To the Southern mind, this was confirmation of what they had long feared, that their way of life, their economy, their very existence was under threat. In the cotton-rich halls of South Carolina, men spoke with fiery certainty. They gathered in December 1860, and in that month of flickering candlelight and anxious oratory, they voted to secede. One by one, other states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, until by early 1861, the map itself had been torn apart. The Confederate States of America was born, complete with its own flag, its own president, and its own grim conviction that separation was destiny. But not everyone in the South believed in the new cause. In small towns, on lonely farms, in the quiet spaces between battle lines not yet drawn, there were those who whispered their doubts. Some feared what would come next, others prayed the fever would pass. Yet the momentum was unstoppable. The rhetoric of war had already replaced the language of compromise. The air in Washington grew tight with expectation. Letters between Northern politicians dripped with alarm. Speeches thundered through Congress halls that smelled of dust and sweat. Lincoln, still days away from his inauguration, wrote in tones of sorrow and determination. He would not allow the Union to dissolve. To him, secession was not only rebellion, it was betrayal. And as his train carried him toward the Capitol, the sense of history tightening its grip was palpable. Meanwhile, in Charleston Harbor, the tension was taking physical form. A fortress, Fort Sumter, stood on a small island guarding the entrance to the harbor. It was a federal post, still manned by Union troops, but surrounded by the newly formed Confederate forces. Supplies were running low. Messages passed in secrecy between military commanders and Washington officials. Each letter carried the same haunting uncertainty. How long could the fort hold out before someone, somewhere, gave the order to fire? Across the country, ordinary people went about their days as if nothing had yet changed. But the signs were everywhere. Blacksmiths were making more bullets than plows. Trains carried troops instead of travelers. Newspapers wrote of two Americas, though no one could yet imagine the true scale of what was coming. In towns from Massachusetts to Mississippi, men drilled in makeshift militias, their blue and gray uniforms still new, their faces still untouched by the terror that awaited them. By the spring of 1861, the land seemed to be waiting, a living, breathing organism caught in the seconds before a storm breaks. There was a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It was the silence of drawn breath, of a world about to change irrevocably. No one could yet imagine the seas of mud and blood that would come, the open fields littered with torn bodies, or the towns emptied of men who would never return. The crack in the nation had become a wound, and that wound was about to open fully. In the early light over Charleston Harbor, the dark silhouette of Fort Sumter stood against the sea, its flag barely visible through the mist. The men within it waited, listening to the quiet rhythm of the waves, and then somewhere across the water, a single spark ignited. The spark came in the stillness before dawn, a sound like thunder rolling over calm waters, a tremor that would echo through generations. April 12, 1861. The grey light of morning stretched across Charleston Harbor, touching the rippling surface of the Atlantic with pale fingers of mist. The air was damp, heavy with salt, and thick with anticipation. Soldiers on both sides, weary from sleepless nights of waiting, finally heard the deep rolling boom that shattered the fragile silence. A Confederate cannon had fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, and in that instant, the American Union, the great experiment in democracy, fractured into war. Inside the walls of the fort, Major Robert Anderson, commander of the small Union garrison, watched as fiery trails streaked across the sky. Shells burst above the ramparts, raining down shards of iron that sent sparks across the worn brick. His men scrambled into position, about 80 soldiers in total, poorly supplied and already weak from hunger. The flag above the fort, the stars and stripes, swayed in the wind like a living thing, each gust pulling at its frayed edges. The men knew they could not hold out forever. They were isolated, surrounded by Confederate batteries positioned across the harbor, at Fort Moultrie, Morris Island and Cummings Point, all ready to unleash their fury. For 34 hours the bombardment continued. Cannonballs screamed through the air, striking stone, splintering wood, and filling the fort with dense clouds of smoke. The men moved in near darkness, coughing from the sulfur and the heat, their eyes red and raw. The roar of artillery became a constant rhythm, one that marked not minutes, but the slow dying of an era. Outside the fort, Confederate soldiers cheered as each explosion lit the sky, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of fire reflected off the water. For them this was not destruction, it was birth, the first heartbeat of a new nation, the Confederate States of America, standing defiantly against what they called tyranny. But even among the cheers, there was unease. The smoke over Charleston Harbor carried with it a scent of inevitability, a grim awareness that once the first shot had been fired, there would be no turning back. The war, though not yet measured in bodies, had already claimed something far greater, the illusion of unity. In the cities of the North, the news of the bombardment spread like wildfire. Telegraph wires crackled with urgency as papers printed extra editions. Headlines shouted from every street corner, "The war has begun." Crowds gathered in public squares, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and grim determination. For many, the thought of war had once seemed distant, even impossible. Now it was real, close, and inescapable. President Abraham Lincoln, who had taken office barely a month before, faced the moment with a heavy heart. He had hoped, even in those last days, that reason might prevail, that the southern states could be brought back without bloodshed. But Fort Sumter had burned away all illusions of peace. On April 15th, he issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was immediate and overwhelming. In northern towns, men lined up in the streets to enlist, their faces shining with patriotism and fear. Bands played, flags waved, and mothers tried to smile as their sons marched away. In the South, Lincoln's call was taken as proof of aggression, a declaration of war against their sovereignty. 4 more states seceded almost at once: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The Confederacy now stood 11 states strong, its capital soon to be established in Richmond, Virginia. What had begun as political defiance had hardened into military resolve. Both sides now saw the other not merely as adversaries, but as traitors. Charleston, the city that had witnessed the war's first light, soon grew used to the constant hum of activity, ships loading weapons, soldiers drilling along the waterfront, and civilians watching from balconies as the harbor filled with smoke. The people cheered their new identity as Confederates, though few yet understood the price it would demand. Inside Fort Sumter, after days of relentless bombardment, Major Anderson's men could no longer continue. Their ammunition was low, their barracks burning. On April 13th, they surrendered the fort to Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard. No soldiers on either side had died during the exchange of fire, though several were wounded. But the lack of bloodshed was deceptive, a quiet prelude before an ocean of carnage. When Anderson and his men evacuated, they carried their tattered flag with them, a symbol of endurance. The flag would later be raised again in that same place, 4 long years and hundreds of thousands of lives later. For now, however, it disappeared into history's shadows, just as the country itself descended into darkness. The days that followed were filled with feverish energy. Across both North and South, men trained in open fields, their muskets new and untested, their uniforms still smelling of cloth and dye. Most believed the war would be short, perhaps a few months at most. Southern leaders spoke confidently of defending their land and way of life. In northern cities, the newspapers promised swift victory and glorious reunification. None could imagine the years of agony to come, the endless graves, the stench of decay that would settle over battlefields from Virginia to Tennessee. As the first regiments began to move, the land itself seemed to stir. Railroads groaned under the weight of supplies and soldiers. Camps sprang up near rivers and forests, rows of tents fluttering in the wind. Blacksmiths hammered iron for cannon wheels. Tailors stitched flags and uniforms through the night. The hum of war had become a kind of music, steady, methodical, and merciless. And in the middle of it all, the enslaved people of the South watched in silence, their fate uncertain. To them, this conflict carried a different meaning, not just the question of union or confederacy, but the question of freedom. Whispers passed from plantation to plantation. Could this be the beginning of their deliverance, or would it end in greater suffering? For now they waited, bound by chains that neither side yet dared to break. In Washington, the mood was somber but resolute. Lincoln walked the corridors of the White House at night, the gas lamps flickering against his weary face. His task was monumental, to preserve the Union without destroying the ideals upon which it stood. Each decision weighed heavily, and each passing day drew the country deeper into conflict. He knew that once the armies met, once the first lives were taken, there would be no easy way back. By summer, the first large armies were forming. Young officers dreamed of glory, politicians of swift victory, but beneath the optimism ran an undercurrent of dread, the quiet sense that the war had awakened something monstrous, something far beyond the control of any government or general. And so the nation, newly divided and brimming with untested courage, prepared to march. The banners were raised, the drums began to beat, and the roads filled with men heading south and west, toward fields that would soon echo with gunfire and death. The smoke that once hung over Charleston harbor drifted into memory, but its meaning lingered, spreading across valleys and rivers, through cities and small towns. It marked the true beginning, the point of no return. The sound of those first cannon shots was still ringing faintly when the soldiers of both sides, their uniforms clean and spirits high, began their journey toward Virginia. There, under a blistering summer sun, they would meet for the first time in open battle. The summer air of 1861 hung thick with dust and expectation. Along rutted roads that wound through fields of green and gold, columns of men moved steadily forward, lines of blue uniforms stretching to the horizon, grey columns answering from the opposite direction. The earth trembled beneath their feet, not from the weight of armies yet, but from the rhythm of thousands of boots striking the soil in unison. They marched toward Virginia, toward names that meant nothing then. Manassas, Bull Run, places that would soon be carved into memory. The war was still young, still clean in the minds of those who fought it. Most were farm boys and clerks, blacksmiths and students, carrying muskets that shone in the sun and haversacks packed with bread, coffee, and letters from home. They laughed as they walked, trading songs and stories, their voices rising above the rumble of wagon wheels. For many, it was their first time beyond the borders of their own counties. They looked at the landscape, the rolling hills, the winding rivers, and believed adventure awaited them just beyond the next ridge. Northern regiments poured out of cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, their flags bright against the sky. Southern volunteers gathered beneath the banners of their states, Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, each convinced that God and destiny favored their cause. Newspapers in both regions promised swift victory. Few expected a struggle that would devour 4 years and more than 600,000 lives. At encampments along the route, the nights were alive with the sound of fiddles, banjos, and low laughter. Campfires dotted the darkness like distant stars. The smell of wood smoke mingled with that of damp wool and boiled coffee. Men wrote letters by firelight, their words full of confidence. "We will be home by Christmas." They could not imagine that some of those letters would never reach their destination, that the fields where they camped would soon become fields of graves. Discipline was still a novelty. Officers, many as untested as their men, learned to command by imitation and instinct. Drills filled the mornings, lines forming, turning, firing in volley. The movements were awkward, the commands shouted through heat and dust. Horses snorted and stamped in the background, uneasy with the new sense of powder and oil. Drummers set the pace with hollow rhythm, the beat of a nation marching into uncertainty. For now the opposing forces remained largely invisible to one another. Reports of skirmishes drifted through rumor, shots exchanged near small bridges, scouting parties disappearing into woods. But the true meeting had not yet come. Still, every man sensed that the invisible distance between blue and grey was closing. Each sunrise brought them closer to the moment when courage would be tested not in words or drills, but in the chaos of battle. The landscape bore witness to their passage. Farm fences leaned where wagon wheels had brushed them. Wells ran low as soldiers filled their canteens. In small towns, families gathered on porches to watch the endless columns go by. Mothers waved handkerchiefs, children shouted, and old men stood silent, remembering other wars whose lessons had long been forgotten. As the dust settled behind the departing troops, a quiet emptiness lingered, a sense that the world itself was changing shape. In Washington, politicians spoke in confident tones, but worry etched lines into their faces. President Lincoln moved among maps and telegrams, aware that enthusiasm could not replace preparation. The Union Army was vast but disorganized. Many of its generals were relics of the Mexican War, their tactics suited to another age. Across the Potomac, Confederate leaders faced the same truth. Their soldiers fought for home ground but lacked weapons, uniforms, and training. Both sides were strong in pride and short on experience. The summer grew hotter, streams shrank to trickles beneath the relentless sun, mosquitoes gathered in the lowlands, and the men scratched at bites beneath their collars. Boots wore thin, the smell of leather and sweat became part of daily life, yet morale remained high. Letters from Washington spoke of an upcoming confrontation, one decisive blow that would end the conflict. The phrase passed from camp to camp, a 90-day war. The men believed it. They wanted to believe it. Among the Union ranks marched artists, teachers, and poets, recording scenes in notebooks that would one day fill libraries. They described the glow of twilight over the Potomac, the murmur of thousands of voices settling into sleep, the distant bark of a sentry's dog. In the South, diarists wrote of departure and devotion, of parades through courthouse squares, where brides and sisters pinned ribbons to the lapels of boys barely old enough to shave. Each page captured a world poised on the edge of transformation. As July approached, the roads converged toward northern Virginia. There, near a small stream called Bull Run, the two armies would finally meet. For weeks, civilians from Washington had whispered about the coming battle as if it were a spectacle. Some even packed lunches and prepared to watch from nearby hills, certain that the Union would sweep the Confederates aside by afternoon. In Richmond, ministers preached that divine favor would protect their sons. The air itself seemed to vibrate with expectation, heavy and unreal. On the eve of the march, a mist rose from the river valleys, turning the campfires into faint halos of light. Men lay awake, staring at the dark canvas of the night sky, listening to the slow breathing of their companions. Some prayed softly, others traced the outlines of home in their thoughts. The world felt suspended, silent, waiting. The scent of dew and gun oil mingled, a quiet promise of the dawn to come. When morning arrived, drums rolled through the camps. Officers shouted for formation. The first rays of sunlight struck the barrels of muskets lined in rows, glinting like water. The men adjusted their packs, tightened their belts, and began to move again, step by step, down the dusty roads that led toward the unknown. The songs had grown quieter now, replaced by the steady rhythm of marching feet. Every mile carried them deeper into history, though none could see it yet. The hills ahead were blue with distance, and somewhere beyond them lay the first great battle. The soldiers could sense it, the change in the air, the hush of the wind through the trees, the way the birds scattered suddenly from the fields, as if startled by something unseen. They marched on, past farmhouses and silent barns, their faces solemn beneath the sun. The sound of their movement filled the valleys, an endless, echoing pulse that seemed to draw the very breath of the land. Evening came slowly, the sky fading from gold to grey. Fires flickered once more along the roadside, small islands of warmth in a vast landscape of uncertainty. The men ate in silence, the taste of ash and salt on their tongues. Somewhere ahead, the two armies were closing the last of the distance between them. The roads that had carried laughter and song now carried only the steady sound of resolve, and as darkness deepened over the Virginia hills, the night held its breath. The first battle of the war was waiting just beyond the horizon, where the rolling fields near Bull Run slept under the moonlight, unaware that by morning they would awaken to chaos. At dawn on July 21st, 1861, the mist that had settled over northern Virginia began to lift, revealing a landscape of low ridges and open farmland crossed by a narrow stream called Bull Run. The fields were still heavy with dew, the grass bending under the weight of it, and in that quiet moment the world seemed almost serene. Yet behind the hills, the two great hosts of the new war were forming, thousands of men blue and grey, lining the edges of the unseen valley. The first major battle of the American Civil War was about to begin. For weeks, the Union Army under Brigadier General Irvin McDowell had prepared to march on the Confederate forces gathered near the little town of Manassas Junction. Washington's politicians had pressed for action. Victory, they said, would bring the rebellion to its knees. Few of them had ever seen a battle. They spoke of quick triumphs, of flags raised and returned before the harvest. So certain were they that the war would end in one bold strike, that members of Congress, journalists, and families from the capital rode out in carriages to watch the engagement from nearby hills. They carried picnic baskets and opera glasses, as if attending a summer pageant. Across the stream waited the Confederate army under General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, bolstered by reinforcements moving under Joseph E. Johnston from the Shenandoah Valley. Their numbers were roughly equal, each side about 35,000 strong. The men were untested, their uniforms mismatched, their officers inexperienced, yet both sides held the unshaken conviction that righteousness would make them victorious. The first gunfire broke the calm like the snap of a great cord. Union artillery opened from the ridges, sending smoke rolling across the fields. The Confederate batteries answered from the opposite heights. Within moments, the clear morning was swallowed by haze. Drums beat through the noise, guiding regiments into motion. Columns crossed the shallow ford at Sudley Springs, their boots stirring the mud. The stream, so peaceful hours before, now mirrored flashes of light from cannon fire. Through most of the morning, the Union attack pressed forward. Blue ranks swept across the rolling farmland, driving the Confederates back toward a hilltop that would soon be known as Henry House Hill. The grass was trampled flat beneath the surge of men. Clouds of smoke drifted between them, turning the sunlight to a dull amber glow. Officers rode along the lines, shouting orders half lost in the roar of gunfire. The smell of powder clung to every breath. Among the Confederate ranks stood a quiet Virginian brigade under General Thomas J. Jackson. When the men around him wavered, he remained still, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," another general cried, a phrase that spread through the Confederate ranks like a spark, giving them renewed strength. The line held. By midday the battlefield had dissolved into confusion. Smoke obscured the landmarks. Units lost their direction. The cries of commands mingled with the thunder of guns until all sense of order faded. Men stumbled through fields they could no longer recognize. Some fought hand to hand in the thick haze. Others fell back through the meadows, searching for their regiments. The heat was relentless, the July sun pressing down like a weight. Observers on the hills outside Manassas could see only fragments of the struggle, a banner rising through smoke, a sudden burst of cannon fire, the brief gleam of bayonets before disappearing into greyness. The crowds who had come to watch fell silent. They had expected spectacle. Instead they saw chaos. Many began the long journey back to Washington before the day was done. By late afternoon, fresh Confederate troops arrived by rail from the valley, the first use of trains to move soldiers in wartime. Their arrival tipped the balance. McDowell's weary regiments, their ammunition nearly spent, could no longer hold the line. When the order to retreat came, it spread unevenly, misheard or ignored in the din. What began as an organized withdrawal soon turned into a desperate flight toward the bridges of Bull Run. Wagons overturned, horses panicked, and the narrow roads jammed with men trying to escape the crush. The civilians who had come to watch found themselves caught in the same tide, their carriages entangled among army wagons as dusk descended. The Confederate forces, equally exhausted, did not pursue far. The field fell into uneasy quiet, broken only by the crackle of fires where fences had burned and the distant rumble of retreating wheels. The first great battle of the war had ended in Confederate victory. Neither side had truly grasped what that meant. As night settled over the ridges, the haze of gunpowder drifted slowly away. The moon rose, pale and indifferent, over the darkened valley. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of trampled grass and spent powder. Officers walked among their men, counting, calling, taking stock of what remained. No one yet understood that this single day had shattered the illusion of a short, clean war. The romantic visions carried from the parade grounds were gone, replaced by a quiet, bewildered sorrow. In Washington, panic followed the returning troops. Rumors raced through the city that the Confederate army would march straight on the Capitol. Lincoln, hearing the reports through the night, sat in silence, absorbing the truth he had long feared. The conflict would not end quickly. Across the South, church bells rang in celebration, but even there the victory carried a note of unease. They had won a battle, not the war. The scale of what lay ahead began to dawn on both sides. By morning the sunlight revealed the battlefield in its aftermath. Smoke curled from the hillsides. The once green fields were streaked with the dark traces of the fight. Wagons moved slowly across the plain, gathering the wounded, carrying messages, bearing news homeward. The war had found its voice now, a low and steady hum that would not be silenced for 4 long years. The soldiers who had survived cleaned their rifles, refilled their canteens, and waited for new orders. They were no longer volunteers seeking adventure. They were soldiers in a conflict without boundaries or end. The roads that had carried them so confidently to battle would soon lead them south again to fields where death and disease would become familiar companions. And as the smoke of Bull Run lifted into the summer sky, the land seemed to fall into uneasy stillness once more. Yet the silence did not mean peace. It was the breath drawn before the next storm, the pause before the earth itself began to darken with graves. The armies on both sides, stunned and sleepless, now looked ahead to the long campaign that was beginning to unfold across the rivers and rolling forests of the American South. The days following Bull Run brought a stillness across the Virginia countryside that was almost unnatural, the kind of quiet that presses against the eardrums and lingers long after the last footsteps have faded. The victory, though celebrated by the Confederates, did not mark an end to the conflict. Instead, it opened the way for a series of campaigns that would stretch across forests, fields, and towns alike. The soldiers, young and untested, began to realize that war was not the brief parade of triumph they had imagined. The grandeur of colors and banners had given way to a more subtle and pervasive presence, the weight of fatigue, the whisper of fear, and the faint, ever-present reminder of mortality. The landscape itself bore the marks of combat. Rolling fields, once green with wheat and grass, were compressed and scarred where men had marched and struggled. Footpaths, trampled by thousands of boots, formed narrow, beaten trails that cut across farms and pastures. The creeks ran murky from stirred sediment, carrying the debris of tents, packs, and remnants of the makeshift encampments hastily abandoned in the rush to engage. Birds circled overhead, their cries a muted accompaniment to the distant thud of distant artillery and the creak of wagon wheels transporting supplies forward. Soldiers moved cautiously, learning with each step that the land was no longer neutral. It carried memory, and it carried warning. In the summer heat, mud clung to uniforms, and tents became smothering, the air thick with dust and the subtle odors of unwashed bodies and packed rations. Even without direct combat, the march of armies left its signature. The soil carried a metallic tang, the faint echo of smoke from spent rounds drifted through valleys, and insects congregated with unnerving patience in the wake of human passage. Camp followers, women who prepared meals and sewed clothes, could smell the shifting air, the mixture of sweat, leather, and iron, and felt it settle deep into the very skin of the men around them. Every morning, the regiments formed anew, the soldiers' energy sapped but their determination unbroken. Letters from home were read aloud, their words sometimes a comfort, sometimes a burden. Some spoke of parents, of sisters, of children, a reminder of the worlds the men had left behind. The sense of responsibility, to comrades, to country, to ideals, grew heavier as the days wore on, and the young soldiers began to comprehend, in a vague and unformed way, that victory would not be measured simply by flags and drums, but by survival. The supply lines creaked under the weight of expectation. Horses carried food and artillery, sometimes collapsing under the strain. Soldiers dug shallow trenches, worked tirelessly to create defensible positions, and carried water from streams that were quickly contaminated with debris and sediment. The labor was grueling, exhausting in a way that the brief exhilaration of marching or the dramatics of a single battle could never replicate. It was the slow attrition of preparation that began to teach the men about the endurance war would demand. In the towns and farms through which the armies passed, civilians emerged cautiously, curious and fearful. Their homes, once symbols of stability and domestic life, became markers of transience. Barns and fences showed signs of hasty occupation. Livestock had been driven off or killed to sustain troops. Fields were scarred and crops trampled. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily into the afternoon, mingling with the distant haze of previous skirmishes, carrying a subtle heaviness that hinted at the human toll of the conflict. Disease, an invisible adversary, began its slow work. Dysentery and typhoid, exacerbated by crowded tents and polluted water, spread quietly among regiments. The sick were tended to in makeshift hospital tents, their faces pale and drawn, their bodies swathed in bandages and linens, hastily washed in cold streams. The subtle sounds of moaning and fevered murmurs became part of the ambient landscape of the army, just as predictable as the rustling of leaves, or the distant toll of church bells in towns left behind. Even on days without fighting, the soldiers' awareness of mortality deepened. Men began to recognize the early signs of fatigue, of heat stroke, of the physical and emotional toll of constant movement. Conversations grew quieter, voices measured and deliberate. Some sang softly to pass the hours, others stared at the sky, imagining distant homes and families, untouched by the growing shadow of war. The moral weight of victory and defeat began to take hold. Every action, every march, every misstep felt charged with significance beyond comprehension. The night brought a different rhythm. Campfires flickered against the darkness, illuminating tired faces in the deep shadows of the surrounding trees. Sentinels whispered, keeping watch over both comrades and the unseen dangers of the forested hills. Wolves or foxes sometimes crossed near the perimeter, their movements swift and silent, a reminder that nature observed the men's passage, indifferent to the human conflicts unfolding within its boundaries. The soldiers slept lightly, their dreams haunted by anticipation, by the noise of battle imagined, and by the faint sense that this was only the beginning. As the weeks passed, the armies moved again, the roads carrying them steadily into the interior of Virginia. They traversed ridges, forded rivers, and passed through towns that had become shadows of their former selves. Every landscape seemed to hold a story of the past engagement. Trenches where men had stood, fences flattened by hurried retreat, and the faint outlines of campsites burned or abandoned. Soldiers began to speak in hushed tones of what they had seen, not with the exuberance of victory, but with a somber understanding that their surroundings were permanent witnesses. The notion of glory, once so bright and immediate in recruitment offices and drum-lined parades, began to fade. In its place emerged endurance, resilience, and a keen awareness of the fragility of life. The men learned that survival depended on constant attention, to water, to food, to orders, to the land itself. The march was not just physical, it was a slow, unrelenting introduction to the rhythm of war, one measured not in cannon fire alone, but in dust, heat, fatigue, and the ever-present sense of loss. The soldiers came to know the fields as both friend and adversary. Rolling hills that seemed inviting in spring now carried the memory of movement and preparation. Streams that had once promised refreshment now whispered of exhaustion and the unseen toll of illness. The sky above, at first a canvas of calm, became a relentless witness to their passage. Sunlight, rain, and storm alike left marks upon uniforms, packs, and spirits. Each day of movement, each night of uneasy rest, folded into the next, a cumulative lesson in the endurance that would define the conflict for years to come. By the time the armies reached the edges of the next engagement, they were no longer merely marching men. They were witnesses to a slow transformation of the land and themselves. They had walked over and through fields now imprinted with memory, and the quiet reminders of mortality were embedded in their awareness. It was in this way, through patient observation of the environment, the exhaustion of long days, and the subtle, relentless marking of time, that the soldiers first learned the true nature of the war that would soon engulf the entire nation. And as they moved onward, the hills and valleys of Virginia stretched before them, the road bending gently into forests and pastures, carrying them unknowingly toward the next great confrontation, where the lessons of endurance and the cost of ambition would be measured once more. The early spring of 1862 brought a fragile warmth to the rolling hills of southwestern Tennessee, where the Tennessee River curved quietly through forests of oak, hickory, and pine. To the casual observer, the landscape appeared serene, a patchwork of fields and woodlands stretching toward the horizon. Yet for the armies of Union and Confederacy, the terrain had taken on a different character entirely. It was a theater of preparation, of anticipation, and soon of profound, unrelenting trial. The small settlement of Shiloh, near Pittsburgh Landing, became the stage for one of the war's most shocking revelations, an encounter that would strip away any lingering illusions that the conflict would be swift, orderly, or contained. Union forces, under the command of Major General Ulysses S. Grant, had established a camp along the western bank of the Tennessee River. Men had spent weeks drilling, building fortifications and ferrying supplies from the waterway inland. The soldiers, many still young and inexperienced, became familiar with the subtle rhythms of the forest, the way sunlight fell through leaves in shifting patterns, the whisper of wind across the river, and the sounds of animals, squirrels, deer, and birds, whose presence seemed almost a comfort. These details, once ordinary, would soon be the markers by which the survivors measured memory. Across the dense rolling terrain, Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston and General P.G.T. Beauregard approached cautiously but with determination. The Confederates were drawn together by intelligence that suggested the Union encampment was vulnerable, resting in apparent complacency along the river. In reality, neither side fully understood the scale of the confrontation that was about to unfold. The vastness of the forest, the meandering streams, and the interspersed farmland would amplify confusion, stretching commands and obscuring visibility in ways no drill could ever simulate. On the morning of April 6, the first volleys of gunfire shattered the fragile calm. The sounds ricocheted through the trees, the cracking of muskets punctuated by the booming of artillery. Smoke rose from multiple points, curling upward to mingle with the morning mist and giving the forest an almost otherworldly quality. The dense woods absorbed sound, creating moments when the thunder of battle seemed near, and moments when silence returned only to be broken again. The trees themselves became witnesses to a slow, relentless struggle, their branches shaking from vibrations carried through the earth. Soldiers pressed forward into the foliage, attempting to navigate undergrowth that slowed movement and obscured vision. Regiments lost cohesion, companies became separated, and officers struggled to maintain order. The soundscape was chaotic. Commands shouted and carried only a short distance, horses neighing and slipping in mud, men moving quickly yet cautiously as they attempted to find familiar faces in a landscape transformed by conflict. The forest amplified every sound, transforming ordinary noises, the snap of a twig, the rush of water through a creek, into signals of danger, raising tension with every step. The wounded in the confusion were often left to move themselves towards safety. The forest floor became a place where exhaustion and injury intersected. Soldiers crawled into sheltered spots beneath fallen branches or into shallow depressions in the earth. Here, the strain of the conflict was immediate, visceral in its subtlety. The thrum of a pulse, the shallow breath, the shaking of hands, and the quiet observation of comrades as they passed by without knowing what might be left behind. There were no orderly hospitals within the immediate fighting zone. Care was improvised, tents erected hurriedly behind the lines, and medical personnel moved with the same uncertainty as the soldiers they tended. As the day progressed, the landscape itself seemed to transform. Trails that had been used for marching became pathways of displacement, churned to mud by feet and wheels. Small clearings became temporary command points, places where generals tried to restore cohesion, issue orders, and orient themselves to a battle that no map could fully depict. Smoke hung in layers, drifting through the canopy, while the sunlight that filtered through the trees was muted, stained with gray. In this haze, perceptions shifted, distance and direction became unreliable, and the familiar shapes of landmarks were altered beyond recognition. The human rhythm of survival, marching, firing, seeking cover, intersected with the relentless pulse of the battle. Men quickly became familiar with the sounds of nearby engagement, learning to recognize when movement, even slight, suggested the approach of comrades or adversaries. The forest floor was littered with remnants of hurriedly abandoned equipment, knapsacks, canteens, discarded muskets, and banners caught in branches. These artifacts of action created both obstacles and landmarks, subtle guides through a maze that the battle itself had imposed. The night of April 6th brought a temporary lull. Soldiers paused where they could, tending to themselves and each other. The moon rose pale through the gaps in the canopy, illuminating the twisted outlines of undergrowth and distant river glints. Fires burned dimly in small encampments or along isolated clearings, creating small islands of light in the enveloping darkness. The sounds of wildlife, previously subdued, returned slowly, their presence a quiet reminder of continuity amidst disruption. Men whispered, sharing sparse words, quietly attempting to process what had occurred in the relentless progression of hours. By the following morning, April 7th, both armies were reinforced, and the battle resumed with renewed intensity. The dense forest and irregular terrain ensured that movements were slow and disjointed. Artillery could be placed only where the ground allowed. Supply lines stretched across paths already congested with the previous day's exertion. The challenge of coordinating maneuvers through this natural labyrinth demanded improvisation and constant attention. Soldiers learned, often painfully, that the landscape itself could be as formidable as the enemy they faced. The environment, once neutral, had become a participant in the conflict. Streams and ravines dictated movement. Trees created both concealment and confusion. Troops developed acute awareness of sound and shadow, of the subtle variations in the rustle of leaves or the movement of soil. They learned to interpret these cues quickly, recognizing that survival often depended on observation, patience, and instinct as much as courage. When the battle finally subsided, the landscape had been altered, paths had been widened and churned by repeated passage, vegetation trampled and clearings reshaped by the necessity of conflict. Fires from artillery and campfires burned in scattered patches, sending smoke into the sky. Soldiers began to take stock of the forest around them, not merely as terrain but as a living witness to the unfolding war, carrying memory, presence and history in every branch and leaf. The aftermath of Shiloh left both sides with a new, somber understanding. Victory and defeat were no longer abstract concepts to be debated in newspapers. They were realities measured in the exhaustion of men, the demands of terrain, and the unrelenting rhythm of movement, supply, and preparation. Each forest path and hilltop would forever carry the imprint of those days, the echo of voices, the rustle of motion, the weight of anticipation. The forest itself had become a silent chronicler, a witness to the passage of armies, the intensity of engagement, and the quiet endurance that would be demanded of all who survived. And as the remnants of both armies withdrew from the fields near Pittsburgh Landing, the Tennessee River flowed on, indifferent and unhurried. Its waters reflected the sky, the trees, and the soldiers as they moved toward temporary camps, carrying with them the lessons of navigation, survival, and the sobering realization that the war, which had begun in Charleston, was expanding across the land with no end yet in sight. As the armies moved away from the shattered forests of Shiloh, they carried more than fatigue and the lingering tension of combat. They carried an unseen adversary, one that had long been a companion of armies, but whose presence would now reveal itself with merciless persistence: disease. In the quiet that followed battle, men tended to wounds and collected themselves in hastily erected encampments, little realizing that their greatest threat might not come from the distant lines of grey or blue, but from the very provisions, water, and living conditions that sustained them. Camp life, in its unassuming rhythms, began to take on a pattern of quiet horror. Rows of tents, pitched in shallow depressions and open clearings, dotted the landscape like markers of temporary order in a world destabilized by warfare. Soldiers attempted to create spaces of routine, lighting campfires in the evenings to cook rations, boil water, and provide warmth. Yet in these seemingly ordinary tasks, the seeds of sickness were quietly sown. Water drawn from nearby streams carried invisible bacteria. Food left in tents or in hot sun spoiled before it could be eaten. Flies and insects, abundant in the warm spring air, became carriers of disease, moving freely among men and supplies alike. Among the illnesses, dysentery and typhoid rose most quickly. Dysentery, often caused by contaminated water, spread silently from one tent to the next, from one company to another. Its symptoms, weakness, fever, and dehydration, crept into the ranks almost imperceptibly at first. Men who had marched, trained, and fought with youthful vigor suddenly found themselves fatigued in ways they could not attribute to exhaustion alone. The command structure tried to respond, moving sick men to temporary infirmaries and dedicating personnel to care. But these measures were often insufficient, improvised, and hampered by the very confusion that the movement of armies created. Typhoid, slower in its onset but equally deadly, was no less insidious. It spread through contact with contaminated food or water and thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of military camps. Soldiers who had survived the immediate dangers of battle now faced the invisible threat of infection. Commanders and medical staff watched as healthy young men became pale and listless, their energy drained even before they had set foot in combat again. The horror of the battlefield was now mirrored in the quiet suffering of the camp, where the wind carried not only the scents of cooking and smoke, but also the faint, persistent odors of sickness and decay. Gangrene, often the result of wounds that had not been properly treated, reminded soldiers of the fragility of life, even when removed from the immediate line of fire. Medical knowledge was limited, supplies inadequate, and antiseptics rare. Infected injuries, if left unchecked, became threats to survival, forcing surgeons to make grim decisions about amputation and treatment. Even in the absence of active combat, these silent enemies dictated the rhythm of life in the camps. The firelight that flickered over tents at night illuminated both the faces of the living and the quiet struggles of the sick. Nurses, medics, and volunteers moved between them, their steps careful, voices low, offering comfort where words were often insufficient. The weather, too, played a subtle but critical role. Warm spring rains turned dirt paths into ankle-deep mud, carried runoff from one encampment to another, and washed bacteria into wells and streams. Soldiers' clothes, heavy with moisture and never fully dried, clung to their bodies, adding to discomfort and susceptibility to illness. Night brought chill even in the temperate season, causing shivering and fever to take hold more easily. And yet, despite the physical suffering, life in the camp continued. Routine was established wherever possible. Drills in the morning, roll calls, sentries pacing through darkened perimeters, and the quiet conversations of men too exhausted to speak loudly. The psychological toll of disease was equally pervasive. Unlike the visible chaos of battle, illness crept slowly, eroding morale and instilling fear. A soldier might witness a friend dragged from a tent, pale and trembling, and never see him again. Letters written home reflected not only the excitement of march and battle, but also the subtle anxiety of unseen enemies. Families worried over their sons' fates, not knowing whether they faced a musket or a bacteria, and soldiers themselves grappled with the uncertainty of survival in a new and invisible theater of war. Rations, though provided in abundance in theory, were frequently spoiled, insufficient, or difficult to distribute. Cornmeal and salted pork, staples of both armies, were prone to infestation by insects or decomposition during transport. The monotonous diet, combined with contaminated water, weakened the men further, leaving them vulnerable not only to pathogens but to the psychological weight of unrelenting discomfort and fear. Soldiers often joked to cope, but humor was thinly spread and quickly replaced by the quiet resignation that this war would demand more than courage alone. Campfires remained a central part of daily life. In the evenings, smoke drifted lazily through the trees, curling over tents and across small clearings. Soldiers gathered around them to eat, write letters, or simply sit in silence. These fires became symbols of life, fragile beacons against the pervasive presence of sickness, fatigue, and uncertainty. The flickering flames illuminated both resilience and fragility, casting long shadows across the men who would march, fight, and endure in the days to come. The forests and fields that had witnessed the chaos of battle now bore witness to this quieter yet equally relentless struggle. Streams, hills, and trees recorded the passage of armies and the unfolding of illness with impartiality. Nature observed without judgment, indifferent to uniforms, allegiances, or suffering, offering only shade, water, and the occasional cooling breeze as comfort. Soldiers learned to coexist with the land as both provider and silent witness, attentive to its subtle cues as they had to the sounds of enemy movement. By midsummer, the armies had adapted to this new rhythm. Campsites were established with attention to sanitation as best as knowledge allowed, latrines dug at a distance from water sources, infirmaries constructed from tents and lean-tos, and small routines imposed to preserve both morale and health. Yet the inevitability of disease could not be entirely mitigated. Each new march, each fresh encampment, carried with it the potential for outbreak, and the men moved forward with an awareness that the enemy was not always visible, not always uniformed, and not always stationary. As the sun set over Tennessee, casting a warm amber glow over tents and makeshift hospitals, the soldiers rested uneasily. The war beyond the battlefields had begun in earnest, a war against fatigue, infection, and the slow erosion of health that would shadow every campaign, every march, and every campfire. And as night fell, the firelight danced over the silent faces of those who had survived, reminding them that the greatest challenge was no longer only the opposing army, but the persistent, invisible specters that would follow them into every forest, across every river, and down every road on which they would march. And as the dawn approached once more, the soldiers would rise again, prepare their packs, and continue onward, carrying with them the lessons of Shiloh, the unseen dangers of the camps, and the knowledge that survival required patience, endurance, and vigilance as much as courage. September of 1862 arrived with a peculiar stillness over the rolling fields and shallow creeks of Sharpsburg, Maryland, along the western banks of the Potomac. The warmth of late summer lingered, touched by the faint crispness of an approaching autumn. Leaves had begun to turn, soft ochres and muted greens brushing the forests along the horizon. From a distance the land seemed serene, peaceful even, as if waiting for some unseen shift, a quiet prelude to a day that would mark the history of a nation. Union forces under Major General George B. McClellan had moved cautiously, aware that Confederate General Robert E. Lee had carried his army northward from Virginia, seeking advantage and a foothold in the north. Lee's movements were calculated, deliberate, but the terrain at Antietam was unforgiving. Narrow roads, ridges, farm fields divided by fences, and the shallow, winding channels of the Antietam Creek itself. The area, dotted with small farms and orchards, had been a place of domestic routine and quiet toil before the war, but now it was poised to witness an intensity that few could have anticipated. The morning of September 17th began in mist, the fog rolling low across fields and hollows. Soldiers awoke in tents and makeshift shelters, their faces pale with anticipation and the weight of weeks of maneuvering. The noise of preparations, buckles and straps, the shuffle of boots, the soft murmur of officers issuing last instructions, was punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery, which had already begun to establish a rhythmic presence along the ridges. Here, unlike many previous engagements, the proximity of opposing forces meant that sound and motion traveled quickly, and every movement was observed, calculated, and countered. As dawn brightened, the first volleys rang out. Musket fire cracked across the orchards and along the rolling ridges, mingling with the deep report of cannon fire from strategically placed batteries. The smoke rose in dense plumes, curling over fences, under trees, and across the shallow channels of the creek. The forested areas absorbed the sound, creating moments of silence that were almost more terrifying than the explosions themselves. Men advanced, halted, repositioned. Officers attempted to maintain cohesion as the landscape, unpredictable and uneven, worked against them. The shallow waters of Antietam Creek, meandering through cornfields and past small farmhouses, became a natural feature that defined the engagement. Crossing these waters was both strategic and perilous. The slow wading disrupted formations, dampened spirits, and provided a natural obstacle that soldiers had to contend with under the unyielding pressure of battle. The creek itself bore witness to the movements of thousands of men, its banks trodden and softened by repeated passage. Mud and sediment clung to boots and uniforms, and the cool water offered only temporary respite in the sweltering September heat. Farmhouses, barns, and orchards along the battlefield became both landmarks and tactical positions. Commanders directed fire from windows and fences. Men advanced through rows of cornstalks and between fences with a cautious precision dictated by both terrain and the ever-present threat of enemy fire. Horses struggled across the uneven fields, dragging artillery, wagons, and supplies. The fields themselves, once sites of harvest and domestic labor, bore silent testimony to the intensity of human activity and conflict. By midday, the battle had reached a scale unseen in the conflict's short history. Artillery thundered from ridges, and musket fire became a persistent, almost constant drone. Soldiers became attuned to the rhythms of sound, the pause between volleys, the distant whistle of incoming rounds, the shouts of officers attempting to rally troops. Smoke obscured vision, turning familiar farm roads and orchards into indistinct grey passages. The sun, warm but muted through the haze, cast a yellowed light that gave every movement a dreamlike quality, as though the world itself were observing from a distance, removed yet intimately aware of every shift and tremor. The human strain was apparent even to those not in direct combat. Soldiers carried the weight of packs, muskets, and provisions while advancing or retreating. Exhaustion compounded tension. Fear was tempered by discipline and the shared presence of comrades. Food and water were rationed in quick measures, and moments of rest were taken in whatever cover could be found, behind fences, under trees, in shallow ditches along the banks of the creek. The soldiers' awareness of mortality grew with every passing hour, and the memory of Shiloh, Corinth, and other encounters hung in their minds, quiet yet persistent. As afternoon turned toward evening, the sounds of battle began to fade gradually, replaced by the low hum of activity that followed a day of relentless engagement. Fires burned at the edges of camps and among supply wagons. Soldiers tended the wounded as best they could, officers accounted for units, and the land itself, marked by movement and disruption, settled into an uneasy quiet. The shallow waters of the creek reflected the sky, tinged with the muted greys and ochres of sunset, as if the river itself were recording the day's passage. Flies gathered along the edges of disturbed earth and along shallow waters, a subtle, persistent reminder of the consequences of close quarters, heat, and human activity. The sounds of birds, largely silent during the height of the battle, returned slowly, their calls echoing through orchards and fields. Smoke lingered in patches across the landscape, curling over fences and creeks, and the breeze carried the combined sense of sweat, gunpowder, and the faint earthiness of disturbed soil. Soldiers moved quietly, their exhaustion evident, speaking little as they navigated the terrain toward temporary encampments. In the towns along the Potomac, civilians observed the distant smoke and heard the intermittent cannon fire, struggling to comprehend the scale of what had transpired. Letters were written and dispatched, some reaching home quickly, others delayed or lost. Families feared for sons and husbands, for brothers and fathers, aware that a day in history had shifted the perception of war from an abstract concept to a tangible, unrelenting force. By nightfall, the battlefield had assumed a different character. The sounds of musket fire had been replaced by the murmur of men tending to their duties and moving supplies, preparing for what would come next. The Tennessee and Potomac battles had taught both sides that the war's pace was unrelenting, its demands physical and mental, and its consequences far-reaching. Even in stillness, the landscape retained memory, subtle shifts in earth, trampled vegetation, and lingering scents, reminders that human endeavors left indelible marks. The soldiers, exhausted and weary, lay beneath the pale light of the moon, their thoughts caught between the routine of preparation and the vivid intensity of the day. Campfires flickered across fields, illuminating faces etched with fatigue, reflection, and quiet anticipation. In this twilight, the lessons of Antietam began to settle. War was no longer a distant event, nor a series of discrete battles. It was continuous, insistent, and pervasive, moving with the men as they advanced, rested, or waited. And as the night deepened over Maryland, the Potomac River glimmered softly in the moonlight, carrying with it the quiet witness of the land, holding in its flow the history of battle, anticipation, and the persistent rhythm of armies moving toward futures yet unknown. In the hours and days following battles like Antietam and Shiloh, the armies began to recognize a harsh, unyielding truth. The true toll of war extended far beyond the field. The aftermath of engagement brought a different kind of labor, quiet, persistent, and unrelenting, that fell on the shoulders of those who wore the dual mantle of soldier and healer. The surgeons of the Civil War, untested by anything of comparable scale in the United States, found themselves navigating a world where life and death converged in close quarters, where each decision was weighted by urgency, limitation, and circumstance. Field hospitals were established hastily in barns, open tents, and commandeered farmhouses, often on the edges of the battlefield itself. Lanterns flickered in dim corners, illuminating tables strewn with instruments, blankets, and the scattered effects of a camp's hurried organization. The smell of medicinal herbs, alcohol, and cloth blended with the acrid residue of gunpowder that lingered from nearby fighting. The constant motion of surgeons and their assistants, fetching water, tending to dressings, recording details, and preparing instruments, created a rhythm that echoed with quiet urgency through the otherwise still buildings. Amputation, a term that struck terror into the imagination of civilians, was a routine necessity for these surgeons. Advances in medical knowledge were minimal, antiseptics rare, and infection a constant threat. Decisions were made quickly, almost automatically, informed by experience, observation, and the harsh calculus of survival. Hands moved with mechanical precision, yet beneath the calm efficiency lay exhaustion and a kind of restrained dread. Surgeons repeated their work, hour after hour, day after day, the faces around them pale with strain, lips tight, eyes heavy from the unbroken focus demanded by the injured and the dying. The soundscape of a field hospital was distinct yet subtle. Lanterns clicked open or swung slightly in the evening air. Water sloshed in tin basins, and assistants whispered instructions or encouragement. Occasional groans or sighs punctuated the otherwise steady murmur of activity, as did the faint clatter of instruments against tables. There was no chaos in this space, only a deliberate, almost ritualized response to the persistent demands of care. Time seemed to fold in on itself, minutes stretched into hours, hours into days, and the surgeons moved with unwavering attention, each movement precise, each decision deliberate. Hygiene, inadequate though it often was, became a discipline unto itself. Linen and cloth were boiled where possible. Water was drawn from nearby streams, filtered as best as circumstances allowed, and assistants moved constantly to maintain cleanliness of both instruments and hands. There was an awareness among the medical staff of the delicate balance between preservation and exhaustion. Every action had weight, for even small oversights could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. The labor of care was continuous, cyclical, and unceasing. The injured arrived in waves, their presence shaping the hospital's rhythm. Soldiers, conscious or unconscious, were tended to with methodical efficiency. The most severe cases received immediate attention, while those with less critical injuries were attended to with equal patience. The men, many still grappling with shock, fatigue, or the lingering memory of the battlefield, became quiet participants in a process both intimate and austere. Conversations were minimal, yet the connection between surgeon and patient, observer and observed, carried an unspoken weight, an acknowledgement of vulnerability, mortality, and the shared endurance of circumstance. Outside the tents and buildings, the remnants of the battlefield seemed to press in. Mud from the roads clung to boots, wind carried faint echoes of distant artillery. The landscape itself retained a subtle imprint of the conflict, its marks persistent and somber. Surgeons and attendants, despite being removed from the immediate fight, were acutely aware of the connection between field and hospital. The movement of men, the passage of cannon, and the distant cries of command all informed their work, a quiet reminder that the land itself bore witness to the human endeavor it had hosted. Medical supplies were limited, often rationed or transported under hazardous conditions. Alcohol and basic anesthetics, such as chloroform or ether, were carefully measured and applied. Needles, bandages, and linen were used judiciously. Every instrument was cleaned, every movement considered, as though the act itself carried an ethical weight. The hands of surgeons, steady and practiced, became the interface between life and mortality, precision and improvisation, endurance and exhaustion. Amid the mechanical repetition of treatment, emotional endurance was equally vital. Surgeons bore witness to fear, pain, and the fragility of life, often while maintaining composure to prevent despair from cascading through their ranks. The act of care became both duty and ritual, a sequence of movements that preserved order in the midst of chaos, that allowed men to survive another day, and that carried the knowledge that the work done now would ripple forward, touching countless future battles and campaigns. The nights in the field hospitals were long and quiet, filled with the ambient sounds of vigilance, lanterns swinging in the soft breeze, the low murmur of assistants, and the occasional movement of horses or wagons on distant roads. Shadows stretched across tables and walls, creating shapes that seemed to float and twist with the flickering firelight. The surgeons, moving from one patient to the next, became ghosts themselves, figures of calm in the midst of a fragile, flickering world. And as each day passed, the field hospitals became microcosms of the war itself. Exhaustion, skill, perseverance, and the steady observation of subtle change defined every action. Time was measured in pulse and breath, in the rising and falling of chests, in the quiet application of treatment, and in the delicate, continuous management of the living and recovering. The surgeons of the shadow carried the weight of the unseen toll, the quiet labor of life preserved in the midst of an unrelenting conflict, reminding all who remained that the war extended beyond the battlefield itself, into the very spaces where humanity strove to endure. The snow-covered ground, a temporary beauty in any other circumstance, took on a strange symbolic permanence. It absorbed footsteps, the shuffle of advancing lines, and the sporadic recoil of gunfire. Here and there, footprints and impressions of boots formed a landscape of human passage, marking both presence and intent. The cold of the season slowed movement, but preserved the immediate traces of action. Objects left behind, equipment, fallen muskets, and discarded packs, remained visible longer than they would have in warmer months, as if the land itself were holding memory in suspension. Observation of the terrain was a continuous exercise. Officers noted wind direction, the slope of the field, the placement of fences, and the frozen creek beds that bisected the landscape. The soldiers, despite youth or inexperience, became attuned to the subtle cues of elevation, the dark line of the enemy behind fortifications, the shifts in snow or ice that hinted at difficult footing. Even in cold and hardship, awareness was constant. Attention to the environment was survival. The afternoon brought a muted, almost dreamlike quality to the battlefield. Snow fell lightly at times, drifting into hair, crevices of uniform, and folds of overcoat. The flurries muted sound, softening the percussive crack of musketry and creating a haze of white over the ridges. Sunlight, when it broke through the clouds, reflected off snow and ice, illuminating the soldier's path and emphasizing both the beauty and the starkness of the winter battlefield. Yet behind the aesthetic lay the relentless reality of combat, the strategic challenge of terrain, the coordination of troops, and the persistent, inescapable presence of danger. Even when volleys of musketry waned, the memory of movement through the open field persisted. Soldiers gathered briefly behind frozen fences, in shallow depressions, or beneath the sparse trees along the approaches. Their breaths rose in fog, mingling with smoke from fired rounds, creating an ethereal quality that seemed to suspend time itself. Here, endurance was measured, not by immediate success, but by the ability to continue, to maintain order, and to survive the arduous rhythm imposed by the day's design. As dusk approached, the fields assumed a quiet solemnity. The snow, disrupted by thousands of footsteps, glistened unevenly in the fading light. Frosted breath, gloved hands, and frozen equipment carried traces of the day's exertion. Fires, small and cautiously tended, flickered along the edges of encampments and behind the advancing lines. Soldiers, their movements slowed by exhaustion and cold, moved deliberately toward temporary cover or the relative warmth of tented areas. The lesson of Fredericksburg became immediate and immutable. War was as much a test of endurance, patience, and observation as it was of courage. Men learned to read terrain and weather with equal attention to their enemies' placements. They understood that the environment, the open field, the slope, the snow, the winter wind, could be as formidable as any opposing force. Survival depended on rhythm, attention, and the persistence to continue despite unfavorable odds. And as the last light of day faded over Mary's Heights, the town of Fredericksburg and the fields beyond were left in quiet anticipation of the nights to come. Soldiers, fatigued but steadfast, prepared for bivouac, tending equipment, and preparing for the inevitable march forward. The snow glistened with a muted permanence, preserving impressions of the day and marking the land as a witness to endurance, human will, and the relentless unfolding of the war. Spring of 1863 arrived in Virginia with the soft hum of renewal in the air, birds returning, sap swelling in trees, and the forest floor dotted with early wildflowers and underbrush beginning to flourish. The wilderness, a dense and tangled forest of oaks, hickory and pines stretching across Spotsylvania County, seemed tranquil, almost impervious to the concerns of men beyond its edges. Yet beneath this veneer of calm, nature bore witness to an approaching maelstrom, a meeting of two vast armies whose movements would transform the forest from quiet refuge into a living, breathing theater of war. Union forces under Major General Joseph Hooker advanced cautiously into the area, their movements slowed by the density of the trees and the undergrowth that choked roads and paths alike. Confederate forces, commanded by General Robert E. Lee, utilized the forest's natural advantages to conceal positions, coordinate flanking maneuvers, and create confusion among the advancing bluecoats. The forest itself, with its narrow trails, thick underbrush, and uneven terrain, imposed a new kind of challenge, one that merged the physical struggle of movement with the strategic demands of combat. As the first encounters occurred in early May, musketry and artillery merged with the sounds of the forest. Branches cracked underfoot, leaves rustled, and the hooves of horses struck the softened earth in sporadic rhythm, all overlaid with the distant boom of cannon and sharp reports of rifle fire. The soldiers learned quickly that in the wilderness, visibility was limited, orientation was challenged by the repetition of trees, the shadows of undergrowth, and the haze of smoke that hung low in the damp air. Orders shouted by officers often failed to carry more than a few paces, forcing units to rely on instinct, training, and the quiet cues of comrades. Fires, whether sparked by artillery, musketry, or abandoned encampments, became both destructive and symbolic. The flames moved unpredictably, consuming underbrush and occasionally spreading to larger trees, while smoke intertwined with the morning mist to create a scene at once ethereal and oppressive. The intensity of heat, the acrid scent of burning wood, and the cloying weight of smoke created a pervasive atmosphere that dulled the senses and altered perception. Soldiers moved through this haze, learning to navigate by instinct and memory as much as by sight, their every step measured, cautious and deliberate. The wounded became part of the forest itself. The canopy filtered light unevenly, casting patches of illumination across undergrowth where men rested, struggled, or attempted to move to safety. Those injured in the earlier skirmishes of the day found themselves interwoven with the environment. Moss-covered roots became temporary support, fallen logs provided cover, and shallow depressions in the forest floor offered a measure of concealment. Medics moved cautiously along the trails, navigating between flames, smoke, and the compressed underbrush, carrying supplies and administering care as best they could in conditions both perilous and unpredictable. Sound became a defining element of the battle. The hollow echo of musketry carried between trunks, artillery fire reverberated through the hills, bouncing from ridge to ridge in a muffled, almost haunting cadence. Voices, distant and fleeting, were sometimes indistinguishable from the ambient noises of the forest, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the rush of water through nearby creeks, and the wind moving through dense foliage. Soldiers became acutely sensitive to the subtlest shift in noise, interpreting every movement as a potential signal of friend, foe, or threat. The forest, for all its beauty and natural resilience, transformed under the weight of human action. Paths widened into narrow corridors of repeated passage, undergrowth was trampled into chaotic patches of mud and foliage, horses and wagons left impressions in the soft earth, abandoned equipment and scattered personal effects became markers of movement, effort, and loss. Fires burned unevenly, sometimes smoldering quietly beneath the canopy, sometimes surging into sudden bursts that illuminated the surrounding trees in a flickering orange glow. In these moments, the forest seemed almost sentient, reflecting the chaos and intensity of the human struggle within it. As the battle continued, both sides realized the challenge imposed by terrain, command and control were hindered, movement became slow and treacherous, and units were often separated by only a few dozen paces yet rendered functionally isolated by dense foliage. The need for adaptation was constant. Soldiers learned to navigate not only by sight and sound, but also by touch and memory, sensing the subtle changes in terrain that indicated elevation shifts, hidden depressions, or obstacles hidden beneath layers of leaves. This heightened awareness, while essential for survival, created a persistent tension, an exhaustion of attention that compounded the physical toll of combat. The evenings brought a deceptive calm. Fires burned along temporary encampments and supply areas, smoke curling into the humid air. Soldiers rested briefly, tending to minor injuries, preparing rations, or simply attempting to catch a few hours of uneasy sleep beneath the protective canopy. The forest, still smoldering in places, exhaled a quiet, humid warmth. The scents of smoke, earth, and pine intermingled with the lingering odors of exertion, medicine, and sweat, creating an environment that was both alive and oppressive, beautiful and suffocating. Amidst this natural labyrinth, the psychological weight of battle became apparent. Soldiers spoke in muted tones, aware that the forest amplified every sound and shadow, that a misstep or lapse in attention could lead to confusion, injury, or worse. The dense foliage and smoke created a sense of dislocation, a disorientation that challenged perception and decision-making. Even in moments of inaction, the environment itself imposed pressure, demanding alertness and caution as though the land itself were a silent participant in the conflict. By the conclusion of the battle, the wilderness bore witness to both strategic brilliance and the indiscriminate toll of war. Trails were marked with repeated passage, areas of fire were charred and uneven, and the undergrowth, once a haven, was reduced to trampled, smoky chaos. Soldiers withdrew, carrying lessons of caution, observation, and respect for the environment that now seemed to command as much attention as the enemy itself. The forest, resilient yet scarred, retained memory in every tree, branch, and footprint, a quiet testament to human endurance, strategy, and the indelible mark of violence. And as the night settled over Virginia, the dense shadows of the wilderness held both silence and watchfulness. Fires burned dimly, the wind whispered through charred trees, and soldiers, weary and cautious, lay under the canopy, knowing that the forest would continue to witness, remember, and silently bear the passage of men, movement, and unrelenting conflict for days to come. July of 1863 arrived with an oppressive intensity over the rolling hills and fields surrounding Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The sun rose mercilessly, heating the already thick air, bending it with waves of shimmer over cornfields, stone walls, and dusty roads. The town itself, small and largely pastoral, had been transformed into a crossroads of destiny, where men from across the nation converged in a convergence that neither landscape nor inhabitant could resist. What had been farmland, dotted with barns, fences, and homesteads, was now the stage for 3 days of concentrated struggle, a crucible in which strategy, endurance, and sheer human will collided under a blazing July sky. Union forces, under the command of Major General George Meade, took positions along ridges, crests, and farmhouses, using every contour of the terrain to their advantage. Confederate troops, led by General Robert E. Lee, approached with measured determination, their movements calculated to seize high ground, disrupt formations, and probe weaknesses. The terrain, once familiar to locals and seemingly static, became a living participant in the battle. Rolling fields, intersecting fences, sunken roads, and clusters of trees shaped the flow of movement, providing both shelter and obstruction. Soldiers learned quickly that every step had consequence, that each rise and dip of land could dictate exposure, concealment, and survival. From dawn on July 1st, musket fire and artillery transformed the landscape. Cannon boomed from ridges, sending vibrations through the earth and echoing across fields in disorienting waves. Smoke drifted in dense layers, clinging to cornrows, fences, and hedgerows, muting sunlight and creating an ever-present haze. The cadence of fire, counterfire, and movement became almost mechanical, a rhythm that soldiers adapted to with grim precision. They observed the sway of trees under wind and shock, noted the rise of dust and smoke along distant ridges, and adjusted every movement in anticipation of sudden shifts in the battlefield's unpredictable geometry. The human experience of Gettysburg was one of relentless exertion and persistent vigilance. Soldiers carried muskets, packs, and equipment across fields that were uneven, obscured, and sometimes deceptively treacherous underfoot. Exhaustion compounded the oppressive heat, and the mental strain of navigating terrain under threat created an awareness of fragility that lingered in every step. Communication was difficult. Commands carried partially or not at all, forcing reliance on visual cues, instinct, and the steady presence of neighboring comrades. Time itself seemed to stretch, condensed into the repeated sequence of observation, movement, and cautious advance. Fences, stone walls, and farm structures became landmarks and points of temporary stability. Rows of corn, once symbols of sustenance and domesticity, became corridors and obstacles, guiding and constraining movement. Each fence or stone wall created a pause in rhythm, a space for reflection, calculation, or preparation, and soldiers learned to interpret the landscape not merely as terrain, but as an active shaping participant in the unfolding conflict. Streams and creeks, flowing lazily and reflecting the bright summer sky, constrained movement and influenced positioning, forcing improvisation and adaptation at every turn. The scale of human presence altered every aspect of the environment. Footpaths became churned to mud. Dust rose from dry earth where movement was rapid or concentrated. Temporary shelters were erected in barns and sheds, providing meager protection from sun, heat, and rain. Fires, tended cautiously to avoid attracting attention or consuming scarce fuel, produced small plumes of smoke that mingled with artillery residue and the lingering haze of gunpowder. The land absorbed all of this activity, sounds, movements, and marks of exertion, as if it were both recorder and witness, impartial yet infinitely patient. Animals largely displaced by the army's presence became unintentional participants. Horses, vital for cavalry and artillery, moved with care across unstable ground, slipping and pulling against harnesses. Livestock, startled and agitated, added to the cacophony, their sounds interwoven with the more ordered rhythms of marching and fire. The wind carried odors, earth, dust, heat, and the subtle, inescapable scent of exertion and suffering that clung to clothing, equipment, and skin, embedding the experience of Gettysburg into the memory of all who remained. As the days progressed, the cumulative weight of movement, exposure, and observation became palpable. Soldiers measured time not by the clock but by the sun's movement across ridges, the long shadows stretching over cornfields, and the progression of smoke from intermittent fires. Even in the brief pauses between volleys, attention remained acute, focused on the faintest movements, sounds, or changes in light. Observation became a form of endurance, and endurance a form of survival, as men relied on instinct honed through repetition, training, and necessity. By the third day, July 3rd, the landscape bore every mark of struggle. Fields were disrupted, pathways widened by repeated movement, and structures scarred by both use and proximity to artillery. Smoke hung low in patches, curling over fences and through orchards. Wind carried scents that were inextricably linked to activity, heat, sweat, dust, and the lingering odor of materials and supplies, all commingled into an atmosphere that was both oppressive and inescapable. The soldiers moved through this space with heightened awareness, their senses calibrated to subtle cues, their endurance tested by environment as much as by opposition. Even as Gettysburg drew to a close, the battlefield retained its presence. Observation points on ridges overlooked the expanse of disrupted fields, the sun reflected off stone walls and fences, illuminating patterns of passage and positioning. Paths and creeks, once natural and serene, were etched with the memory of movement, strategy, and human exertion. Soldiers, exhausted yet vigilant, moved toward temporary rest areas, recognizing that the lessons of terrain, rhythm, and adaptation were as vital as any victory or defeat recorded in dispatches. and as the sun set over the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, casting long muted shadows across cornfields, fences, and the contours of the land, Gettysburg itself seemed to pause in quiet observation. The wind carried traces of all that had passed through, heat, smoke, and endurance, reminding those who remained that the battle was more than combat. It was a shaping of land, rhythm, and human perception, leaving an indelible mark that would endure long after the armies had departed. Beyond the smoke of battlefields and the relentless movement of armies, the war unfolded in quieter, less visible theaters, small towns, farms, and households scattered across the North and South. These places, often untouched by direct combat, were nonetheless transformed by the constant presence of war, its rhythms and consequences carried invisibly through letters, wagons, and whispers of rumor. The summer heat and winter frost did not distinguish between soldier and civilian, and in towns that were spared the immediate roar of gunfire, a different, subtler endurance took hold. Women, the backbone of these communities, assumed responsibilities that had previously been dispersed across entire families. They sewed uniforms, repaired boots, and mended equipment for the soldiers who were absent, their hands moving with practiced precision and quiet determination. Each stitch carried both practicality and an unspoken hope that the clothing they repaired or fashioned would offer protection, comfort, or identity to those far from home. Their workrooms, often kitchens or parlors, illuminated by the soft light of candles or oil lamps, became sanctuaries of focused activity, where the relentless passage of time was measured in stitches, threads, and folds of fabric. Coffins, lined neatly in cornered rooms or along the edges of town squares, were constant reminders of the fragility of life and the universality of loss. Funerals were measured and deliberate, the procession of wagons, draped in flags and silent with solemnity, moved slowly through streets that seemed to have shrunk under the weight of grief. Children too young to comprehend fully became observers of ritual and repetition, learning early the language of absence and mourning. They noticed the long lines of wagons, the quieted streets, and the somber expressions of neighbors, and in doing so absorbed a knowledge of mortality and endurance far beyond their years. Letters became a lifeline between the front and the home, their arrival an event marked by anticipation and trepidation. Messengers, postmen, and returning travelers carried envelopes that bore the weight of family, hope, and anxiety. Handwriting varied, sometimes careful and deliberate, sometimes shaky or smudged, and the contents ranged from mundane details of weather and provisions to stark declarations of loss. Words written in haste or with trembling hands were often tear-stained, the ink blurred at edges, yet each conveyed connection, continuity, and memory. Mothers, wives, and siblings unfolded these letters with a mix of relief, sorrow, and resignation, absorbing the realities of absence while maintaining the fragile routines of domestic life. Communities adapted in response to the constant ebb and flow of information and personnel. Schools and churches, once centers of learning and worship, became spaces of utility and reflection. Classrooms transformed into supply depots, sanctuaries serving as meeting points for the coordination of aid. Towns became networks of communication, their residents attuned to news arriving from railroads, horseback couriers, or visitors from neighboring regions. The ebb and flow of soldiers' presence and absence dictated the rhythm of markets, work, and conversation, creating a landscape of anticipation, vigilance, and careful adjustment. Every household, no matter how small, carried the imprint of war. Kitchens, once filled with the scent of bread and simmering stews, now absorbed the aroma of fabric dyes, tallow candles, and disinfectants used to maintain hygiene in temporary infirmaries. Gardens and fields tended with care were harvested not only for sustenance, but for the preparation of food packages for soldiers. The mundane acts of everyday life, mending, cooking, cleaning, were imbued with significance, as each contributed to the invisible machinery that supported survival, endurance, and hope across the lines of battle. Children, too, were participants in this quiet theater of war. They learned to recognize wagons draped with flags, signaling the movement of bodies or wounded, and became familiar with the sight of pallbearers, solemn neighbors, and mothers and fathers attempting to shield grief beneath stoic expressions. Even play was tempered by observation. Games mimicked marches or uniforms, and stories from older siblings or returning relatives carried lessons of courage, endurance, and careful attention to circumstance. The young absorbed not only the information but the rhythm of waiting, vigilance, and perseverance. The evenings in these towns were marked by reflection and ritual. Candlelight illuminated tables where letters were read aloud, mended uniforms folded for distribution, and prayers were whispered into the quiet. The wind carried sounds from distant farms and fields, the faint creak of wagons, the murmur of neighbors, and the soft calls of nocturnal animals. Every element seemed to participate in a delicate balance of life and endurance, where the weight of war was omnipresent yet mediated through routine, care, and shared observation. Even in the absence of direct combat, towns were not untouched by the logistics of war. Supply wagons rumbled along dusty roads, carrying provisions, mail, and news from the front. Horses, harnessed and steady, transported goods across terrain altered by years of conflict. The streets, empty in the heat of afternoon or hushed by snowfall, bore the marks of repeated passage, ruts, footprints, and the faint echo of distant voices. The landscape itself seemed alive with memory, preserving the subtle imprints of human movement, endurance, and adaptation. The emotional labor of the home front was continuous. Residents measured the passage of days through letters, the arrival of supplies, or the rotation of familiar faces returning from distant battlefields. The awareness of loss was tempered by perseverance. Sewing, cooking, tending children, and maintaining homes became acts of defiance against despair, subtle affirmations that life continued even under the shadow of conflict. Women and men alike developed a quiet endurance, marked by vigilance, ritual, and the careful management of both emotion and expectation. By nightfall, towns settled into a fragile rhythm. Candlelight flickered in windows, smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, and the air was thick with anticipation for the morrow. Families gathered in muted conversation, reflecting on letters, memories, and the knowledge that soldiers on distant hills and fields faced trials as relentless as any born at home. The streets, while empty of direct movement, carried the subtle presence of war in every sound, scent, and shadow. And as darkness deepened, enveloping farms, streets, and houses alike, the quiet towns behind the lines became both sanctuary and witness. Every stitch sewn, every letter read, every child's eyes attentive to the passage of flags and wagons, was part of the ongoing endurance that undergirded the larger conflict. The rhythm of life persisted, fragile yet unbroken, carrying forward the awareness that war was not solely fought in fields and forests, but in the hearts, hands, and quiet perseverance of those who remained to sustain it. In the sweltering heat of Georgia, near the small town of Andersonville, the landscape seemed indifferent to human suffering. Pines and scrub brush stretched across sandy soil, and a river wound lazily through the region, its waters sluggish and tepid under the relentless sun. It was here that the Confederacy established Camp Sumter, more commonly known as Andersonville Prison, a place whose notoriety would endure long beyond the end of the war. The camp itself was enclosed by wooden stockades, and the air carried a mixture of heat, dust, and the persistent, pervasive odor of human hardship that seeped into every corner of the enclosure. Thousands of Union soldiers arrived over months, their numbers swelling far beyond the camp's capacity. Tents and rudimentary shelters were sparse or non-existent. Men were left exposed to the sun by day and the chill by night. The sandy ground, once a feature of quiet pasture, became a uniform expanse of compacted earth, interspersed with the tracks of constant movement, shallow depressions, and the remnants of hurriedly constructed latrines. The camp's design, intended for containment rather than comfort, created an environment in which human endurance was tested daily against hunger, exposure, and the relentless march of disease. The prisoners' lives followed a rigid rhythm, dictated not by choice but by necessity. Morning light brought a sparse distribution of rations, small in quantity and of questionable nourishment. Men moved cautiously to obtain water from a nearby stream, a task complicated by overcrowding, contamination, and the oppressive heat that made every step laborious. With little to occupy them beyond observation and survival, prisoners learned to measure time by shadow, sun, and the sequence of ration delivery, each hour extending perception of hunger and exhaustion. Disease spread with merciless efficiency, exploiting the close quarters, inadequate sanitation, and weakened bodies. Dysentery, scurvy, and typhoid became omnipresent threats, invisible yet relentless. The sick were tended as best as circumstances allowed, with minimal medical intervention and limited supplies. Isolation, when available, offered only partial respite. The pervasive stench of illness hung over the camp like a tangible weight, carried on the wind and absorbed into clothing, skin, and hair. Every breath reminded prisoners that the environment itself had become as formidable an adversary as any opposing army. The visual landscape of Andersonville was striking in its severity. Men moved with deliberate slowness, skeletal forms emerging from the dusty expanse, their clothes tattered and uniforms faded from sun and wear. The mud near water sources became a grim mixture of soil and waste, clinging to bare feet and making every step an effort. In shaded areas, small groups huddled together, conserving warmth and providing limited solace through proximity. The stockade walls loomed overhead, a constant reminder of containment, vulnerability, and the inescapable rhythms of the camp. Observation became essential. Prisoners scanned the movements of guards, the arrival of supplies, and the subtle changes in weather that dictated access to water and shade. Communication with neighbors allowed for minor coordination, sharing food, advising on water sources, or assisting the weak in movement. These small acts of cooperation provided more than practicality. They offered a fragile thread of human connection in an environment defined by scarcity and suffering. The psychological weight of Andersonville was persistent. Men faced the relentless passage of time with limited distractions, their minds attuned to every sound, the creak of gates, distant voices, and the occasional rumble of wagons bringing more prisoners or provisions. Shadows lengthened slowly in the afternoon, and the glare of sun on sand created a distorted landscape where perception and fatigue intertwined. Sleep, when possible, was shallow, disrupted by heat, discomfort, and the ambient sounds of the crowded camp. Evening brought little relief. The sun sank behind low hills, casting long muted shadows across the dusty ground. Fires, when permitted, were small and carefully tended, providing warmth, light, or minimal cooking capacity. The air cooled slightly, but the persistent odors of human presence, sweat, dust, waste, and disease, remained. Men lay in improvised positions, bodies pressed against one another or against the hard earth, attempting to conserve energy while enduring discomfort. The rhythm of survival became cyclical. Observe, move, wait, and endure, repeated with relentless regularity. Letters from home, rare but treasured, arrived sporadically through aid societies or returning visitors. These messages, often short and fragmented, carried a sense of connection and hope. Even amid the stark reality of deprivation, prisoners read and reread such letters, sometimes aloud in whispered tones, as a means of preserving memory, identity, and mental resilience. In the absence of physical sustenance, these fragments of communication became psychological lifelines, grounding men in a world beyond the stockade walls. Andersonville's geography itself amplified endurance. The sun-drenched sand absorbed heat throughout the day, radiating warmth long after dusk. Sparse shade offered brief respite, and trees at the camp's edges were distant and largely inaccessible. Water, drawn from a nearby stream, was both essential and contaminated, forcing careful rationing. Every aspect of the environment dictated behavior, constrained movement, and imposed vigilance. The land, indifferent yet demanding, became as much a participant in survival as the guards and rations themselves. Through the relentless months, the camp became a theater of quiet observation, measured endurance, and adaptation. prisoners developed routines to conserve energy, manage limited resources, and maintain small measures of hygiene and comfort. Each day passed in a rhythm defined by scarcity, observation, and the subtle negotiation of physical and psychological thresholds. The skeletal figures of men moving slowly across the dusty expanse became the defining image of a space where survival, adaptation, and endurance intertwined inextricably with suffering. And as night fell over Andersonville, enveloping the stockade in the deep, humid stillness of Georgia, the camp held a silent testimony to human resilience and the unrelenting challenge of deprivation. Shadows stretched across sand and mud. The wind carried the faint scent of water and earth, and the prisoners lay in uneasy rest, their endurance measured in moments of movement, attention, and breath. The camp itself became a silent witness to the persistence of life under extreme conditions, recording in subtle ways the passage of time, the weight of deprivation, and the quiet, inexorable rhythm of survival. The summer of 1863 brought relentless heat and an oppressive weight to Vicksburg, Mississippi, perched high upon bluffs overlooking the mighty Mississippi River. From these heights, the city's position was both strategic and precarious, a sentinel over the river's currents and a focal point of military ambition for Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant. Yet from the perspective of the inhabitants and defenders within the city, the bluffs and fortifications offered little more than the awareness of a slow, patient siege, where time itself became an enemy almost as formidable as the opposing army. By May, the encirclement of Vicksburg was nearly complete. Artillery positions lined the surrounding hills, and Union forces constructed entrenchments that constrained movement, cutting off supply lines and access to food and medical resources. Within the city, civilians and soldiers alike confronted a gradually intensifying reality. Provisions dwindled, and each day of waiting deepened the strain of both hunger and exposure. The Mississippi River, wide and slow, reflected sunlight in glimmering waves, a silent observer to the human endurance that unfolded upon its banks, indifferent to suffering, yet central to the military calculations of both sides. Civilians responded with ingenuity and resilience. Basements and rudimentary shelters became spaces of refuge, and many dug shallow caves or cellars into hillsides to escape bombardment. These subterranean refuges, often cramped and dark, became sites of quiet adaptation, where families preserved what little food they had, attempted to maintain hygiene, and endured the constant anxiety of artillery fire above. The sound of shelling reverberated through these spaces with a muted, almost rhythmic persistence, echoing off walls of earth and stone in a manner both oppressive and strangely constant. Food scarcity became a defining element of life in Vicksburg. The city's inhabitants, stripped of conventional supplies, resorted to consuming animals normally reserved for work, mules and other livestock. Small game, rodents, and even unconventional edibles such as boiled leather or the roots and shoots of plants were incorporated into daily survival. Each meal was measured carefully, portions rationed, and the preparation of food a delicate negotiation of heat, smoke, and the limited tools available. Despite these efforts, hunger persisted, gnawing at strength, morale, and the rhythms of daily life. The soldiers within the city, similarly constrained, moved with a careful economy of energy. Drill and patrol continued when possible, yet exhaustion and scarcity dictated behavior. Water from cisterns or limited wells was consumed sparingly, and attention to conservation extended to every aspect of activity. The careful movement of supplies, the regulation of firewood, and even the timing of exposure to sun and heat. Every action was measured, not only for efficiency but for survival, as the siege imposed a relentless pressure that tested endurance beyond the physical and into the psychological realm. The urban landscape itself was transformed under siege conditions. Buildings, once bustling with domestic or commercial activity, bore scars of artillery and constant movement. Streets, quiet in times of shelling, were punctuated by the deliberate pace of couriers, foragers, or the movement of essential supplies. The rhythm of the city adapted to the ebb and flow of danger. Moments of activity were cautious, deliberate, and observant. Periods of inaction were tense, filled with anticipation of sudden disturbance. The Mississippi, ever present below the bluffs, reflected light across rooftops and walls, offering a quiet counterpoint to the ceaseless human struggle above. Observation became a critical tool. From elevated positions, soldiers and civilians alike scanned the horizon, noting the placement of artillery, the progress of entrenchments, and the movements of enemy forces. The city's defenders, aware that the siege was as much psychological as physical, maintained vigilance through a combination of discipline, observation, and the careful management of fatigue. Even minor lapses in attention could invite disaster, whether from artillery or infiltration, and so focus became a constant companion, exhausting in its persistence yet essential to endurance. Nightfall brought a fragile rhythm of rest. Fires burned in carefully chosen locations, their smoke serving both practical and signaling purposes, yet revealing positions to those watching from surrounding hills. Families and soldiers huddled in the shade or within dugouts, exchanging sparse words, tending minor injuries, or simply resting bodies and minds strained by deprivation. The Mississippi, reflecting the moon and stars, remained an indifferent witness, flowing silently past the city, unconcerned by human suffering yet central to the siege that defined daily life. Despite scarcity, routines persisted. Children assisted with small tasks, women prepared food and clothing under challenging conditions, and soldiers maintained defensive positions and patrols. Even in the face of hunger, fatigue, and continuous stress, the rhythm of care, vigilance, and measured movement provided structure. It was a quiet testament to human endurance, where survival was both practical and psychological, an adaptation to environment, circumstance, and the inexorable passage of time. By July, as the siege reached its culmination, the city was a study in patient endurance. Walls and fortifications bore witness to repeated bombardment. Streets reflected the passage of both civilians and soldiers engaged in constant movement, and shelters both above and below ground preserved what little comfort remained. The Mississippi flowed past, ever constant, reflecting sun and sky, a silent chronicle of events and endurance beyond the immediate perception of those within the city. And as the final days of resistance approached, the rhythm of Vicksburg, daily observation, measured activity, rationed sustenance, and careful vigilance continued unbroken. Every step taken, every ration consumed, every glance toward the distant hills was an act of endurance, an assertion of life in the shadow of siege. The city, the river, and the hills became intertwined witnesses to human resilience, survival, and the persistent, unyielding passage of time under the relentless weight of war. In late 1864, the landscape of Georgia lay quiet at first glance, the rhythm of farm life and rural existence unbroken, the air warm with the late summer sun, and the trees casting long shadows across fields of cotton, corn, and wheat. Yet this calm was deceptive, for across the horizon came a steady, deliberate movement, the army of General William Tecumseh Sherman, advancing southward with a precision that transformed both land and perception. The march was not merely a military maneuver, but a vast, methodical assertion of control, a movement through which the very soil, settlements, and infrastructure of the South would become instruments of strategy, endurance, and quiet devastation. The first indications of the march's progress were subtle. The distant thrum of hooves on dirt roads, the low vibration of wagons rolling across bridges and paths, and the faint shimmer of dust rising in gentle waves from fields and thoroughfares. As the columns of men approached, the rhythm of the environment shifted. Trees, hedgerows, and fences bore witness to movement that was both inevitable and unstoppable. Birds and small animals fled from the encroachment, their cries punctuating the distant murmur of disciplined activity. The cadence of marching soldiers became a persistent background, almost musical in its consistency, as thousands of men and animals moved in measured, unbroken lines. Towns, once symbols of local commerce and domesticity, transformed under the advancing army. Smoke rose from rooftops, signaling both occupation and the deliberate destruction of supplies, mills, and structures that could aid the opposing forces. Streets that had been populated by residents, traders, and children were now emptied, silent except for the measured footsteps of soldiers and the occasional creak of wagons laden with provisions. The architecture, fragile in its human scale, bore witness to the strategic decisions that prioritized the mobility and sustainability of Sherman's forces over the preservation of property or infrastructure. The railroads, arteries of movement and commerce, were twisted, torn, and rendered unusable. Tracks were pried from ties, rails bent, and sleepers burned, a methodical erasure of pathways that had once carried crops, people, and communication. The physical geometry of the land itself became both obstacle and record, each alteration leaving an indelible mark of military presence and deliberate intervention. Hillsides, valleys, and river crossings bore traces of encampments, marching formations, and logistical adjustments, creating a layered map of human movement across a landscape that had previously been continuous and undisturbed. Smoke and fire became persistent companions. Fields, barns, and structures burned with a measured intensity, rising in columns that mingled with the humid Georgian air. The scent of smoke, charred wood, and heat permeated both open areas and forested margins. Soldiers moved with attention to their own safety and the discipline of their units, while the broader landscape absorbed the marks of fire, blackened soil, smoldering stumps, and the soft ash of leaves and thatch that had once been domestic spaces or productive farmland. The visual rhythm of the march, columns of men, clouds of smoke, and the intermittent glimmer of reflective metal, created a landscape simultaneously dynamic and desolate, alive with movement yet marked by calculated destruction. Rivers and streams were negotiated carefully. Bridges, where preserved, were strengthened or monitored. Others were bypassed or destroyed to impede pursuit. Water sources were contested and utilized with strict discipline, for the sustenance of men and animals was essential to maintaining the march's continuity. The physical environment shaped behavior, dictating the pace, formation, and positioning of soldiers, as well as the placement of temporary encampments. Every interaction with the landscape required observation, calculation, and endurance, the army moving in harmony with terrain as much as in opposition to human resistance. The daily rhythm of the march combined movement, rest, and observation. Soldiers rose with the sun, their footsteps following the careful alignment of columns. Noon brought periods of heat and exhaustion, tempered by sparse shade or river crossings. Evening offered temporary reprieve in fields or along roads cleared of immediate threat. Fires were carefully tended for cooking, light, or warmth, but also as instruments of strategy, controlled yet pervasive. Every action carried layers of intention, nourishment, discipline, and the imprinting of movement across both human and environmental dimensions. Observers of the march, civilians, enslaved populations, or displaced residents, witnessed the transformation of familiar landscapes. Farms and plantations were emptied, fields trampled, and the orderly appearance of rural life replaced by the measurable marks of human occupation and intervention. The psychological impression was as significant as the physical, the movement of Sherman's forces serving as both deterrent and instrument of disruption. The land itself, scorched, trampled, and reshaped, became a participant in the march, absorbing the rhythm, movement, and consequences of strategy in ways that would endure long after the soldiers had passed. The persistence of the army imposed a temporal rhythm, a passage of days measured not by conventional hours but by movement, observation, and adaptation. Soldiers monitored supply wagons, coordinated the rotation of units, and maintained the flow of the march, while simultaneously observing environmental conditions, weather patterns, and terrain challenges. The combination of human discipline and environmental influence created a measured, almost ritualized pattern: movement, adjustment, pause, and continuation. By the time Sherman's columns approached the city of Atlanta, the landscape of Georgia bore a persistent and quiet testimony. Smoke lingered over burned structures, fields bore the impressions of marching lines, and forests were punctuated by scorched margins. The march, methodical and deliberate, had transformed both perception and environment, creating a continuum in which human presence, endurance, and movement left indelible traces. As night settled over the burned and scarred landscape, soldiers found temporary rest along roadsides or in fields, the rhythm of day yielding to the softer cadence of evening. Fires burned dimly, wind carried the scent of smoke, and the terrain absorbed the persistence of movement. The march, continuing in thought and memory, etched a quiet, relentless mark upon Georgia's soil, a testament to endurance, strategy, and the transformative weight of human action across an expansive and receptive landscape. The early days of June 1864 brought a heavy, oppressive heat to Hanover County, Virginia, where rolling fields, small woodlands, and farmsteads stretched across gentle hills and shallow valleys. Mist rose from the ground in the dim pre-dawn hours, the fog clinging to crops, fences, and the low-lying depressions that cradled the landscape. The morning seemed still, almost serene, yet beneath this deceptive calm lay the anticipation of human movement, strategy, and endurance that would soon transform the countryside into a theater of grim determination. Union soldiers, preparing for the assault, ordered by General Ulysses S. Grant, faced both the physical and psychological weight of impending action. In the pale, diffuse light, men wrote their names on scraps of paper, tucking them into pockets or pinning them to clothing, a quiet act of preparation for the possibility of death and a reflection of the foreboding that filled the atmosphere. The terrain, with its shallow ridges, sunken roads, and scattered fences, imposed both limits and guidance on movement. Every contour was memorized, every depression noted, and every rise calculated as the soldiers arranged themselves for the charge. The fog that lingered over the fields served as both cloak and barrier. Visibility was limited to mere paces in some areas. The outlines of comrades and distant earthworks softened into grey smudges against the muted morning. The repetition of training, drills, and cautious observation became critical, as soldiers relied on subtle cues to maintain alignment, preserve cohesion, and anticipate obstacles. Even the soft sounds of wind and the faint rustling of leaves required attention, interpreted in a landscape now transformed into a site of imminent trial. At the first signal, the rhythm of the battlefield shifted abruptly. Soldiers advanced with measured, synchronized steps, muskets at the ready, their movement constrained by both topography and tactical design. Fences and shallow ditches provided temporary pauses, points of leverage, or sudden obstacles to be crossed under intense focus. The interplay between terrain and human motion defined the pace and strategy of engagement, each man adjusting instinctively to both the physical resistance of the earth and the invisible demands of anticipation and endurance. Artillery and musket fire soon intersected with this careful rhythm, the sound of cannon booming and bullets whistling a relentless, almost mechanical cadence. The fog amplified and distorted these noises, making distance deceptive and perception uncertain. Soldiers responded by measuring each movement, coordinating silently with neighbors, and using the limited landmarks provided by trees, fences, and earthworks. Observation became heightened. Attention was focused simultaneously on immediate steps, the alignment of units, and the distant flashes and smoke indicating enemy positions. The ground itself bore witness to the effort and consequences of repeated assault. Soil churned under the passage of thousands of men, creating uneven surfaces that required attention to every footfall. Mud formed in depressions, collecting moisture from earlier rains, and dust rose where the soil was dry. Every obstacle, whether natural or resulting from prior combat, became a test of endurance, strength, and observation. Soldiers adapted to each irregularity in the terrain, with careful calculation, recognizing that success, survival, and cohesion depended on precise and measured movement. The human presence on the field created a rhythm that was both continuous and fragile. Soldiers advanced, paused, and regrouped, responding to signals and cues both audible and visual. Energy was expended in repeated sequences of movement, observation, and adjustment. Bodies shifted with exertion, sweat glistened under the rising sun, and uniform fabric adhered to skin damp with heat and fatigue. Even amidst the chaos, a disciplined order persisted. Alignment, movement, and responsiveness defined the passage through both space and time on the battlefield. As the fog lifted with the rising sun, the consequences of the early assault became visible. The landscape, once soft with shadows, revealed the accumulation of human movement, endurance, and loss. Earthworks bore the impression of repeated assault. Pathways were churned and uneven. Fences and shallow ditches marked both obstacles and points of temporary cover. Observation of these features became critical for survivors, each rise and depression noted for movement, concealment, or retreat. Medical personnel, constrained by terrain and circumstance, moved carefully among the wounded. The heat amplified discomfort, while the fog and smoke mingled to create an atmosphere of muted chaos. Attention to detail was required. Every step, every motion, every breath demanded awareness, both to preserve life and to maintain the fragile order of units and movement. Even in suffering, the endurance of soldiers was tested by necessity, environment, and the continuity of operational rhythm. By midday, the rolling fields and shallow woodlands bore the mark of concentrated human effort, persistence, and observation. Every contour, every path, every shadow contained evidence of engagement, endurance, and adaptation. The sun's ascent intensified visibility, but also the weight of exposure, both physically and psychologically. Soldiers adapted, moving with continued attention to terrain, unit cohesion, and strategic intent. The interplay of light, shadow, and landscape created a constant, quiet challenge to perception and endurance. Evening brought a muted respite, the fog returning in low patches along sunken roads and low fields. Fires, small and cautiously tended, offered light and warmth to soldiers recovering from exertion and fatigue. The wind, shifting over hills and through shallow valleys, carried the sense of earth, sweat, and lingering smoke, embedding the memory of movement, labor, and exposure into the consciousness of men who remained. Observation, vigilance, and careful adaptation persisted as the day gave way to night, the rhythm of survival continuing with deliberate, unbroken cadence. And as darkness enveloped the rolling fields of Cold Harbor, the land itself seemed to pause in quiet witness. The contours of ridges, ditches, and fences retained the imprint of human movement and endurance. Soldiers rested with tentative relief, their awareness attuned to every sound and shadow. The battlefield, muted but alive with memory, absorbed the sequence of exertion, observation, and adaptation that defined the morning's assault, becoming a permanent testament to both the resilience of those who endured and the persistent, relentless weight of human effort under the shadow of war. Beyond the rolling hills, charred fields, and scarred earth where soldiers fell and rose again, the hospitals of the Civil War became silent theaters of human suffering, endurance, and relentless care. Makeshift buildings, commandeered barns, and hastily erected tents transformed the landscape into spaces where the physical and psychological weight of war gathered into concentrated form. The long rows of cots stretched endlessly, arranged with clinical precision yet filled with men whose bodies bore the imprint of musket, cannon, and the unyielding labor of days spent under fire. Every surface, from the wooden floors to the stretchers themselves, absorbed the rhythms of movement, pain, and the unspoken terror that accompanied injury and illness. The sensory environment of these hospitals was overwhelming yet persistent in its subtle rhythms. The stench of disinfectants mingled with the coppery tang of blood, the acrid odor of decay, and the faintly sweet chemical bite of chloroform used to dull the immediate pain of surgery. Air, heavy with humidity, or the faint chill of early spring mornings, carried these odors to every corner, settling in clothing, hair, and skin. Each inhalation was a reminder of the persistent presence of injury, death, and the relentless demands of care. Yet within this oppressive atmosphere, work continued, measured and deliberate, as nurses, surgeons, and orderlies adapted to the limits of space, time, and supplies. The visual field within these hospitals was one of muted repetition and overwhelming scale. Rows of cots, beds, and stretchers extended into shadowed corners, often separated by only a narrow aisle. creating both pathways of access and claustrophobic confinement. Patients lay quietly, moaning softly or breathing shallowly, their bodies marked with dressings, bloodstains, or the signs of infection. Surgeons moved with a mechanical precision, performing amputations or debridement with calm efficiency, their hands guided as much by instinct as by observation. Nurses worked tirelessly, washing and reusing bandages, attending to wounds and providing a human presence that balanced both technical skill and the subtle necessity of reassurance. The psychological rhythm of these spaces was persistent. The constant sound of groans, whispered pain, and the occasional shouted instruction formed a background hum, a cadence against which every other action was measured. Even brief silence carried its own weight, allowing the mind to register the magnitude of suffering and endurance that coexisted within the hospital walls. Observation, both casual and meticulous, was essential. A slight shift in breathing, pallor, or movement could indicate either deterioration or improvement, each carrying immediate consequence. Time in these hospitals seemed to stretch, measured not by clocks but by cycles of pain, treatment, and attention. Surgeries occurred in intervals dictated by necessity, daylight, and resources. Each procedure an exercise in endurance for both patient and practitioner. Bandages were boiled, linen washed repeatedly, and instruments reused with careful attention to cleanliness despite the limitations imposed by circumstance. Every action, even small, contributed to the delicate balance between life and death, the preservation of function and the faint glimmer of hope that persisted amid despair. Movement within the hospitals was deliberate and constrained. Nurses and orderlies navigated narrow aisles with trays of instruments, water, or food. Surgeons passed with precise steps, aware of both the urgency of procedures and the fragility of human endurance. Patients, when moved at all, did so with assistance, often accompanied by a neighbor's touch or a hand on the shoulder to steady both body and mind. Even the smallest gesture, adjusting a pillow, dampening a fevered brow, or changing a bandage, required attention, coordination, and an understanding of both physical and psychological resilience. The environment itself shaped perception and endurance. Windows, where present, offered filtered light that moved slowly across the cots, illuminating the contours of faces, limbs, and instruments. Shadows shifted in subtle patterns, lengthening across wooden floors, stretchers, and walls, marking the passage of hours. Fires, candles, or oil lamps added a flickering glow that created both illumination and tension, the interplay of light and shadow reinforcing the presence of human struggle, careful observation, and persistent vigilance. Odors, sounds, and tactile experiences combined to create an immersive, continuous atmosphere of endurance. The smell of disinfectants and medicine intertwined with the scent of boiled bandages, sweat, and the lingering residue of blood and infection. The quiet moaning of patients, punctuated by the occasional exclamation of pain or instruction, formed a rhythm that guided movement and action. Even the soft rustle of linens, the scraping of chairs, or the clatter of instruments contributed to the persistent sensory presence, embedding the work of survival into every corner of the hospital. Hope in these hospitals was subtle, intermittent, and fragile. Small signs, a patient's ability to lift a hand, a faint smile, or the successful application of a dressing became markers of endurance against the overwhelming presence of injury and illness. Nurses and surgeons adapted continually, improvising with limited resources, managing not only physical wounds but the fragile mental resilience of those in their care. Every movement, glance, or adjustment was an act of endurance, a testament to human patience, skill, and perseverance under extreme conditions. By nightfall, the hospitals assumed a quiet, measured rhythm. Fires burned low, shadows deepened along walls and cots, and the groans of the wounded became softer, almost meditative. Orderlies moved with careful attention, tending to immediate needs while preserving energy for the hours yet to come. The ambient odors, subtle yet persistent, remained a constant reminder of labor, care, and survival. Observation, vigilance, and adaptation continued, ensuring that the fragile balance between life and death remained, if only tenuously, maintained. And as darkness enveloped the rows of cots, stretchers, and makeshift beds, the hospitals themselves seemed to breathe with the rhythm of human endurance. Every corner held memory, attention, and the subtle imprint of movement, care, and survival. Even in the presence of despair, the quiet persistence of nurses, orderlies, and surgeons created an ongoing narrative of resilience, embedding into the walls, floors, and shadows a testament to both the cost and the endurance of life under relentless trial. As the spring of 1865 deepened into early April, the air over Richmond, Virginia, thickened with heat, smoke, and the tension of inevitability. The city, long the political and symbolic heart of the Confederacy, had become a crucible in which both strategy and desperation converged. Streets that had once thrummed with commerce, political discussion, and domestic activity now held an eerie, anticipatory quiet, punctuated intermittently by the hurried movement of wagons, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the distant, muted roar of artillery echoing from surrounding fortifications. From a distance, the James River reflected the sky and the subtle glow of fires that had begun to flicker across the city, a quiet, ever-present witness to the approaching collapse. Civilians navigated streets that had transformed into corridors of survival. Families moved with deliberate care, carrying what belongings they could, often shielding children from the smoke and chaos that crept into every alleyway. Windows and doors that had once framed domestic life now served as fragile partitions between safety and exposure, the glare of fire and the encroachment of Union forces pressing ever closer. The ambient smells of the city shifted in measurable ways, the usual aroma of cooking and soot intermingled with smoke, charred wood, and the acrid stench of panic and human stress. Each breath carried both a reminder of danger and an imprint of human endurance, shaping perception and movement alike. Buildings, once symbols of permanence and governance, began to yield to circumstance. Fires, sometimes accidental, often deliberate as a measure of denial or desperation, spread across blocks of homes, warehouses, and government offices. Timber groaned under heat, windows shattered under pressure, and bricks blackened under flame, creating a visual tapestry of destruction that both reflected and dictated the rhythm of civilian flight. People moved along streets with careful observation, choosing paths that offered the greatest possibility of escape, often stepping over debris, fallen boards, or the remnants of hurriedly abandoned possessions. The river, the lifeblood of Richmond, took on a reflective, almost surreal presence. Under the glow of firelight, its waters mirrored the red and orange of burning buildings, creating an optical landscape in which reality and reflection intertwined. Boats and barges, once tools of commerce and transportation, were pressed into service for evacuation, carrying civilians, supplies, or small groups of the fleeing wounded. The current itself remained constant, indifferent to the human chaos upon its banks, yet integral to movement and the strategies of both escape and occupation. The psychological weight of Richmond's collapse was persistent and multidimensional. Civilians, long accustomed to the rhythms of urban life, now measured time by the advance of smoke across the sky, the distant crack of artillery, and the intermittent glimmer of flames through alleys and streets. Fear interwove with fatigue, and decision-making became a continuous exercise in risk assessment: which path was safest, which bridge would hold under the pressure, and when to pause for water or shelter. Observation, both deliberate and instinctive, became the mechanism by which survival persisted, shaping every action, posture, and moment of movement. Streets themselves transformed under the strain of human movement and destruction. Cobblestones, dirt paths, and wooden boardwalks bore impressions of hurried flight, wagon ruts, footprints, and the occasional collapse of hastily constructed barricades. Horses strained against harnesses, their hooves pounding in rhythm with the anxious steps of those attempting escape. Debris from collapsed or burning buildings created both obstacles and cover, forcing constant adaptation and careful attention to the shifting dynamics of environment and human presence. Every sensory detail contributed to the atmosphere of collapse. Smoke clung to hair, clothing, and skin, carrying with it the faint, bitter taste of charred wood and ash. The heat radiating from burning structures combined with the warmth of spring air to create an almost oppressive humidity. Sounds traveled in strange ways, amplified by alleys and interrupted by walls, producing echoes that distorted perception. The distant calls of Union troops, the clatter of wagons, and the occasional shout of a fleeing family all blended into a continuous rhythm, embedding the passage of crisis into the consciousness of those who remained. Amid the chaos, human endurance manifested in quiet, measured ways. Families coordinated movements, helping the elderly, carrying children, or stabilizing wagons overloaded with possessions. Soldiers still loyal to the Confederate cause guided retreat, cleared paths, and assisted civilians when possible. These acts, though small, created threads of continuity, resilience, and adaptation within the larger tapestry of destruction. Observation, vigilance, and careful timing determined success in survival, emphasizing the subtle persistence of human agency amid overwhelming circumstances. As the sun sank toward the western horizon, the city's twilight was both literal and symbolic. Flames climbed higher, smoke thickened, and the river reflected the glow in deep, rippling patterns. Civilians moved steadily, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, each step deliberate, each breath measured. Buildings continued to yield to fire and structural fatigue, yet the city's architecture, streets, and riverbanks preserved the memory of movement, endurance, and human adaptation across a landscape in flux. And as night fell over Richmond, enveloping streets, riverbanks, and the lingering smoke, the city assumed a final, measured stillness. The river, reflecting the red glow of destruction, seemed to hold the memory of every step, every flight, and every effort toward survival. Streets, alleys, and sidewalks retained impressions of hurried movement and careful negotiation. In the quiet that followed, Richmond itself became a witness, absorbing the weight of collapse, human endurance, and the inexorable passage of time, leaving a lingering testament to both loss and resilience as the Confederacy exhaled its final, measured breath. April 9, 1865, brought an unusual stillness to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, a quiet village whose ordinary streets and modest homes were about to host a moment of extraordinary consequence. The surrounding countryside, marked by rolling fields, sunken roads, and distant woodlands, bore the subtle traces of months of marching, skirmishes, and the continuous passage of weary soldiers. Yet on this day, the hum of movement and the clatter of artillery had faded into a profound, almost oppressive calm. The air was tinged with the faint warmth of spring, carrying with it both the lingering scent of earth and the subtle hints of smoke and decay from distant skirmishes. Union and Confederate soldiers, alike exhausted by years of relentless campaigning, maintained a posture of quiet discipline. Lines of men stretched across fields and roads, standing in a stillness that contrasted sharply with the habitual movement and urgency that had defined their lives for 4 years. Musket and cannon rested, lowered in acknowledgement of the day's extraordinary circumstance. Faces, sunburned, dirt-streaked, and etched with fatigue, reflected the cumulative weight of exhaustion, hunger, loss, and the ongoing demands of survival. Eyes that had once scanned horizons for danger now surveyed comrades, friends, and foes with a mixture of reflection and muted apprehension. Within a small, modest parlor of a private home, Generals Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant met to formalize the surrender that would bring the long, agonizing conflict to its official conclusion. The room, furnished simply with chairs, a table, and muted curtains filtering soft afternoon light, held an almost sacred stillness. No fanfare disturbed the air, only the subtle creak of wood and the quiet rustle of papers punctuated the space. Both men, aware of the enormity of the moment, conducted themselves with measured calm, their conversation deliberate, formal, yet underscored by the recognition of the human cost represented by every uniformed figure standing beyond the parlor walls. Outside, the assembled troops bore witness to the slow, deliberate procedures of surrender. The sun slanted across the fields, highlighting the lines of men in blue and grey, their shadows stretching toward one another, converging in the visual impression of unity after division. Soldiers shifted on their feet, some adjusting gear, others standing rigid with exhaustion, yet all were bound in a shared rhythm of stillness. The battlefield had disappeared. The land itself seemed to absorb the quiet, retaining memory of years of struggle, movement, and sacrifice. The silence was profound. It carried with it the echoes of distant campaigns, the memory of groans from field hospitals, the faint imprints of smoke from burned towns, and the enduring presence of landscapes once marred by artillery, marching lines, and human suffering. Observation, a habit honed over years of war, became a vehicle for reflection, each man measuring the passage of time, the weight of loss, and the subtle relief of a conflict concluded. Every step, glance, and breath was attuned to a world suddenly unburdened of immediate danger, yet heavy with the imprint of accumulated experience. Even in the absence of combat, the human body and mind bore the imprint of endurance. Men shifted uneasily, muscles stiffened by months of marching and exposure, faces lined with sun, dirt, and the stress of constant vigilance. Psychological fatigue mingled with physical exhaustion, producing a state of quiet introspection rather than celebratory relief. Victory and defeat merged into a single nuanced awareness: survival after relentless effort, the necessity of adaptation, and the recognition of countless comrades who would not witness this moment. The village streets themselves became repositories of collective memory. Horses, wagons, and equipment stood in tentative stillness, their presence both practical and symbolic, marking the intersection of movement and immobility. Dust stirred faintly in the late afternoon breeze, carrying subtle scents of earth, leather, and faint smoke from nearby fires. Buildings absorbed the weight of observation, every wooden beam and shutter a witness to the convergence of weary armies, exhausted leadership, and the profound quiet of surrender. Letters and messages, when dispatched or received in this context, held extraordinary significance. Couriers moved deliberately, bearing documentation of surrender, logistical arrangements, and instructions for the orderly disbanding of forces. The physical act of writing, reading, and exchanging these documents mirrored the mental processing required by soldiers and commanders alike: reconciliation of experience, awareness of consequence, and the careful negotiation of both immediate survival and future uncertainty. As evening approached, the light softened across the fields. Shadows deepened along fence lines, trees, and undisturbed roads. Soldiers remained in their positions, some seated, some standing, all observing a rhythm dictated by circumstance rather than movement. The air, still warm, carried the faint, lingering odors of past engagements, earth and vegetation, blending into a sensory backdrop that reinforced both observation and quiet reflection. In these hours, the land itself seemed to participate in endurance. Gentle hills, sunken roads, and open fields preserved the traces of previous marches, skirmishes, and encampments. The very soil, marked by human presence, and the passage of countless boots, horses, and wagons, became a repository of memory, silently chronicling both suffering and perseverance. Observation, reflection, and careful attention were required to discern the narrative embedded in the landscape, each contour and shadow preserving the subtle story of endurance across time and space. And as darkness settled over Appomattox, enveloping parlor, streets, and fields in soft shadow, a profound quiet held sway. Guns had fallen silent, marching lines had paused, human movement, strained over years of conflict, slowed to stillness. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike carried with them both relief and fatigue, reflection and residual sorrow. The village became a witness, absorbing the cumulative weight of 4 years of conflict, preserving in shadow, sound, and observation the delicate, enduring rhythm of human perseverance that had persisted, despite relentless challenge, suffering, and the unyielding demands of war. With the surrender at Appomattox, the Civil War formally concluded, yet the quiet that followed was heavy, layered with the accumulated memory of years of relentless conflict. Across the United States, landscapes bore subtle and stark reminders of human endurance, destruction, and sacrifice. Rolling fields, once scarred with fortifications, earthworks, and the churned soil of repeated assaults, now stretched under a softer light, revealing both the traces of battle and the resilience of nature slowly reclaiming its course. Rivers, which had borne witness to campaigns, sieges, and strategic crossings, flowed on with indifferent continuity, reflecting sunlight over waters once disrupted by the urgency of human movement and survival. Everywhere graves, both formal and informal, stretched across the land, quietly testifying to the scale of loss. Markers, headstones, and simple mounds of earth stood among fields, forests, and hills, silent witnesses to the individuals whose lives had ended amid gunfire, disease, or exposure. The act of burial, while sometimes hurried or incomplete in the midst of combat, became a ritual of remembrance, preserving both identity and memory in the landscape. In quiet reflection, observers noted the patterns these resting places formed: clusters around churches, along roads, and near former encampments, creating a mosaic of endurance, grief, and the persistent, almost tactile presence of mortality across terrain. Towns too were rebuilding, often literally upon the bones of the past. Streets bore traces of charred timbers, collapsed structures, and foundations disturbed by artillery or fire. Rebuilding was cautious, deliberate, and layered. Homes restored, fences replaced, fields replanted, and civic structures erected. Yet beneath every brick and beam lay the memory of what had been lost, the shadow of conflict embedded in the urban and rural fabric. Residents moved with a measured rhythm, attending to both immediate necessities, food, shelter, and safety, and the subtler work of restoration, observation, and memory. Nature itself seemed to adjust to the cessation of violence with slow, deliberate continuity. Grass sprouted over churned fields, trees extended branches into spaces once cleared by siege or marching columns, rivers resumed patterns interrupted by logistical crossings and artillery placement. The air, once thick with smoke, rot, and dust, gradually cleared, though subtle odors lingered, faint reminders of disruption and decay. Even in the quiet, the environment preserved memory, soil, water, and vegetation, absorbing the imprint of both conflict and human endurance, embedding the story of suffering, adaptation, and survival into the very elements of the land. Communities sought continuity through ritual, remembrance, and adaptation. Monuments, markers, and memorials were constructed, often at sites of concentrated loss, providing focal points for observation and reflection. Families commemorated those who did not return, recording names, dates, and experiences. Letters, diaries, and memoirs became instruments of both memory and caution, embedding personal and collective narratives into broader historical understanding. Even as daily life resumed, these acts of remembrance ensured that the war's shadow remained perceptible, a guiding presence shaping civic consciousness and cultural identity. The physical and psychological landscape of the nation bore enduring traces. Soldiers returning home carried scars both visible and invisible, limps, amputations, and other wounds intertwined with memories, habits of vigilance, and the persistent awareness of fragility and endurance. Civilians, too, bore the weight of scarcity, displacement, and personal loss. Observation, attention, and adaptation, developed through years of necessity, continued to shape the interactions of individuals with each other and with their environments, influencing behavior, routines, and collective memory. Economic, social, and environmental systems adjusted gradually. Railroads and infrastructure were repaired, though gaps remained where tracks had been twisted or towns burned. Agricultural production resumed, but with attention to altered soil, the presence of graves, and the memory of past scarcity. The labor, endurance and careful observation required for survival during war became essential for rebuilding, a continuous rhythm linking past and future. The air carried a subtle, persistent hum of continuity, in which human effort, memory, and natural processes intertwined. Even the passage of time itself seemed to carry dual weights, the forward momentum of reconstruction and adaptation, coupled with the persistence of memory, loss, and the traces of suffering. Shadows of battles lingered in hills, forests, and fields. Echoes of artillery and musket fire persisted in oral histories and the physical impressions left on roads, rivers, and buildings. Observation became both personal and collective, a mechanism through which lessons, endurance, and memory were transmitted across generations. Ultimately, the nation, scarred yet enduring, began to knit itself together with cautious hope. Communities, individuals, and landscapes carried the imprints of 4 years of violence, the smell of rot and iron in fields, the echo of footsteps across churned soil, the subtle glow of smoke over once burned towns, and the persistent pattern of graves across both rural and urban areas. In these spaces, memory and observation merged with life and continuity, ensuring that the cost of unity, sacrifice, and endurance remained present, even as life itself resumed its subtle rhythms. And as the land settled under the quiet of twilight, the air itself seemed to retain a whisper of everything that had transpired: the groans of the wounded, the measured steps of marching soldiers, the crackle of burning towns, and the slow, deliberate labor of survival. The nation rose, fragile and tentative, from ashes, blood, and memory, carrying within it the persistent imprint of endurance, observation, and adaptation. Across fields, forests, rivers, and towns, the landscape held both scars and promise, a testament to the human cost of division, the resilience of those who endured, and the quiet, unbroken rhythm of life that continued after the guns finally fell silent, leaving behind a whisper of rot, smoke, and the price of unity.